If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, foresters, hikers, and people who live in the middle of the woods and forests, what strange and weird thing or creature have you encountered out there? This happened to my grandmother sometime this summer, and she told me the story today. She lives in Finland in a rural area. Before the glitch happened, she was outside and burning some wood and stuff in the fireplace. For some reason, she turned 180 degrees towards crop fields and forests when she saw that a line of trees between two crop fields was moving to the right. She then turned back to the fireplace, unable to believe what she saw, and turned back to look again, and this time the trees were sinking. Whole line of trees, about 10 or something. She turned away again, and when turning back for the third time, only one tree between the rest was sinking. I questioned her to get a clearer picture, and she said the trees were at first noticeably moving sideways. I thought it might have been like, when watching out of a bus or train window for a long time, things that don't move also appear to be moving. But then, the second time, they were sinking to the ground. It can't really be an optical illusion, I thought at first, because now the moving is in a different direction. And the weirdest part is that she said that the third time, only one tree was sinking, and it noticeably got shorter than the trees next to it. It wasn't something you see in the corner of your eye, she was looking straight at those trees. I cannot explain this. I was walking through my local park at around 7 p.m. I do this every day as a little walk on my way back from an intense cardio session at my girl's house. However, this day, behind a line of trees, I heard rustling, thinking this was a squirrel, raccoon, fox, or any forest animal. However, this changed when I started to hear grunting noises. This piqued my interest, so I decided to peek over, and what I saw made me look at life differently. There was a male, probably in his 30s, lying face down in the leaves. He was moving around, but it wasn't a natural movement. It was almost as if he was jittering but glitching, like in movies or games. In this instant, I got goosebumps, and I had this strange feeling as if everything around me was going unclear and I was starting to zone out. I can't remember what happened after this, as I was found by a walking pedestrian passing out on the floor. I can't believe I still remember this, but every day it seems as if everything on that day becomes more unclear. Something was in those woods, and whatever it was not human. I've always had a legit fear of the woods near my childhood home, up until I moved out at 18. Something was in those trees, something looked into my windows and doors from the dark beyond my sight. The darkness beyond the glass always seemed otherworldly, like the dark hid creatures beyond fear and imagination. Every time I was up late, I would always close every door and window on the ground floor. I wanted every conceivable barrier out of my sight. I am not normally a fearful person, but something outside in those woods made my blood run cold as ice. I was always terrified that one night I would see something inhuman leering at me, hungry and knowing I was vulnerable. There were times I heard whispers and voices that came from the darkness that could not possibly be there. Whatever was making those voices, I knew I was listening. Whatever it was could not see me, but it knew I was there. I would hear just enough to know it was a human voice, but I could never make out words. It wasn't a neighbor or a radio or anything, I know those sounds, and this wasn't it. Something was out there on some of those nights. Something stalked those woods behind my house on those nights. I do not know what it was. I used to go ghost hunting, and we knew of a haunted forest that was supposedly haunted by a black dog-like spirit with red eyes. We were walking around in it for about an hour, and out of nowhere, we heard and felt the weight of something heavy and big on the ground nearby. This massive black dog-looking creature hurtled across the path and up a tree. Now we all had flashlights, and we watched as the entire tree shook with the weight of this creature and a few other trees, as well as if it had hopped across them. When we got to the tree, we searched around, and nothing had been disturbed. No tracks, no skids in the bushes, and so we all, like 6 of us, turned and practically ran out of that forest. We assumed it was some kind of animal, but the dogman thing is interesting. It sure freaked us out. I don't know what kind of animal it was, but it was big, and we lived in Delaware at the time. There aren't a lot of animals that big and fast in our forests, but I could be wrong. I looked up Dogman, and all I could find were the cartoons. So there is a national park type place near me with woodlands and a beach in a huge area. 2 odd things have happened there, one to me and one to a friend. Her story is that she was out with her brother, and they got lost for hours. When they found where they were, they checked the time, and it had been 20 minutes. The weird thing that happened when I was there was that I was on a path to get back to the main path. I took a fork in the path to a large path, but it didn't seem to be the right one somehow, which was odd because I know the place pretty well. About 20 steps onward along the big path, it was like the sound came back on, I hadn't noticed it had gone. I turned around, and I was on the right path. About 40 steps behind me was a children's play area. Lots of kids were making noise. This has been an odd one for years, stuck in my mind, trying to explain it, but I can't. It's a bloody weird place, though, but I love it there. To start off, I live in a rural part of East Tennessee. The closest grocery store is about 20 miles from here. I am pretty much surrounded by farmland. The area in which I live has been known for decades for being haunted. The land behind my house is all farmland. The past few months, I have been going outside at night to water my garden, and I can hear strange noises coming from the field behind my house. I've heard what sounded like a woman screaming. I've heard someone saying, "Hey." I even thought I heard my mom say my name from the field before. My husband had heard a voice say his name on multiple occasions, but last night my dog was barking and growling like crazy, so my husband went outside to look around to make sure nothing was out there, and he said he heard what sounded like a baby crying in the field, but he said it sounded very distorted and definitely not human. He ended up coming back in, and we went back out to listen, and the noise had stopped. I am not sure what's going on. We live on Indian burial grounds. The whole area I'm in is basically an Indian burial ground, so I heard. My husband is half Cherokee, and he said he just has a feeling it may be a Wendigo or skinwalker. I just wanted to get a few opinions on what it could possibly be because it seems like it's getting braver. I know I could write it off and say it's just a mountain lion or something like that, but saying mine and my husband's name on different occasions makes me believe it's obviously not an animal. Has anyone else in Tennessee had an issue like this, or just anyone in general? Oh, and I almost forgot, this past winter we had a few deep snows, and one morning when I went out to the backyard, I saw these prints that looked like the toe part was a goat hoof and the back was like the back of a high heel shoe. The print was about a foot long. I'm not sure what that could have been. Okay, this is actually really interesting. So I used to do free-running stuff. My dad thought it was cool, so he would come with me. Well, one time we decided to go into the woods behind our house. It's a pretty cool area. There are plenty of spots where there are just old bottles, cans, crates, and all sorts of stuff from ages ago. Cool little sites like that, to see what we could find. Plus, free running through the woods is fun and a good workout. But yeah, so we were running through these woods. Surrounded by hills, trees, leaves, and the sound of a creek in the background. I think we ended up doing something like either follow the leader, tag, or something for fun. But I got way away from him, and I climbed a tree. And he didn't know where I went. I remember watching him, and he looked like he was focused on something. I didn't know what he was running after, but he was following something. And he went up and behind a small hill. So I followed him. When I caught up with him, he looked super confused to see me. He said that he thought he saw me ducking behind trees. So he started running towards me. Only as he was getting closer did he realize he couldn't really make out what he was looking at. He said it was almost like a dark or shadowy humanoid figure. He figured it was just his vision playing tricks on him. So he just kept going. At some point, he couldn't see the figure anymore. So he stops, and I come up behind him. He was caught off guard completely. He is pretty taken back because there is no way he could have been following me. The figure was way up ahead of him in the woods. And I was just behind him in the opposite direction. Obviously it wasn't me, because I was watching this happen from my point of view. Though I never saw the figure. When I was about 14, I was sitting in the back of my dad's property, which is not very large. It was wooded and about less than an acre. Nevertheless, what I saw made me very terrified at the time. So anyway, I was sitting at a tree with a BB gun looking for squirrels or something to shoot. I kid you not, it was foggy the day this happened. It was spring, so the snow was melting and creating the fog around me. I have an unnerving feeling about being out there as well. Well, I was located on a hill, and at the bottom of this hill is a creek that fills up with water when the snow melts. Lo and behold, as I'm sitting next to this creek, a weird creature-looking thing comes out of it, running really fast. I was caught off guard by how fast this thing was moving. It zigzagged about 50 feet away from me. It looked like a large rat with 6 dark black legs. I thought it was a rat at first, but it was too big. I was mesmerized by this thing because it was so strange. Well, after it started running towards me, I got out of there ASAP. Once I got back to the house, I was terrified. I went back to check it out days later and found nothing. I haven't seen it yet. My ex and I were in the woods when I was living in England, I'm American, about 15 years ago. It was right next to a pond called the Silent Pool in Surrey. I don't know how well known it is. It was a very cold night in January, so there weren't any lightning bugs. We were the only ones there, in thick woods. To my left, about 7 blue lights were hovering, about an inch in diameter. They started moving very slowly. There was enough moonlight to see that there wasn't anyone standing there. We froze. There was no noise. The light was obviously independent or not attached, or a laser. They moved closer. When they got to about 4 feet away, my ex absolutely panicked. He bolted and left me there. I ran in the direction of the car and eventually made it. I don't believe in fairies or demons. I've always held the notion that UFOs or ghosts may exist. I just don't know what it was. I didn't feel as though it was benevolent or non-benevolent. It definitely felt otherworldly. I'm just looking for people with similar experiences. I wanted to explain an encounter with something. I'm not quite sure what it was. I had gotten into an argument with my mom about the hat man that was leaning over me while I slept on the couch, something my sister informed me of the following day. A lot of weird stuff happened at that house. But that wasn't the encounter. No, it was after the argument. I was walking out of the house down the road, where we were surrounded by woods, and a small swamp was behind our place. I was walking down the road, which was side by side in a wooded area. Not many people came down where we were. So I was listening to music while on my walk, and I felt like something was watching me. I lived in Alabama, so it was weird. Nobody came into our woods. Not ever. I looked over, and there I saw it. It was hunched over and huge. It had pale features and was so skinny that I could see its ribcage. The thing that took me off was its mask-like face. It didn't wear a mask, but its face had mask-like features. The only reason why I say its face wasn't wearing a mask was because I could see its mouth perfectly. It had dark eyes. I thought it had eye bags, but maybe because I was trying to reassure myself. I heard a branch crunch under its hands. I like to assure myself that they were at least it reminded me of a human, but it was all wrong. Please someone tell me they've got some explanation, because I can't. So this was back when I was a freshman at Quinnipiac University in Hamden, Connecticut. Me and my buddies used to go into the woods behind the campus to smoke weed all the time. One night, a bunch of us were doing just that when, on our way back to campus, just myself and one other friend saw something darting through the woods. My memory is a little fuzzy because it was so long ago, but we both still talk about it to this day. What we saw was a very tall, slim, pale gray figure running faster than any human can. We were both bugged out, also high as shit, but we know what we saw. The main difference between a lot of these other sightings is that it was not on all fours, it was running on 2 legs. Possible crawler? What do you think? This is a story that I heard from my father, and we have no explanation for what he saw. I would appreciate any guesses to help us identify this creature. So one time he spent the night in the forest with his dog. A dachshund trained for hunting, he was walking down a road separating 2 parts of the forest. He then realized that his dog, who walked in front of him, had stopped walking, ran back to my father, and sat down behind his legs. Then my father saw that someone was coming from the forest. He believed it was someone on the back of a horse because he only saw the reflections of an eye, but they were too high up to be a walking person's. Then he realized the eyes were way bigger than a normal human's. He said they were the size of tennis balls, and they were also really far away from each other. He noticed that the creature was looking around because the reflections disappeared and reappeared as if it were turning its head. When the creature saw my father, or at least acknowledged his presence, he fixed its eyes on him and came out of the trees. According to my dad, it was levitating. It was at least 50 centimeters, 20 in, off the ground. It had no sound and was skinny, but he was wearing some type of robe or clothing, so there was nothing else to see beside his eyes, whose colors appeared to be a mix of red, brown, and gray. The creature did not confront my father or something, it simply levitated through the path and disappeared in the woods on the other side of the road. And this is weirder than it seems, since that side of the forest is just a narrow, 3 to 4 meters, 150 in, wide region of trees and stuff. After the trees, there is a concrete fence to separate the forest from a factory. After this encounter, my father turned back because he did not want to risk a second meeting. He spent the rest of the night in a different area. In the morning, he went back to check for trails, but the creature did not leave any signs of his presence. No footprints, nothing at all. This happened in Hungary in 2002. I live in Pennsylvania, and my friend and I went to a nature preserve at around midnight because it's fun to be creeped out, classic white people in horror movie stuff. The woods we were in went on for 5 miles, and we made it about 6 minutes into the woods when we came to the first fork in the road. Now this isn't our first time in these woods at late hours, and whenever I am there, I do get a bit paranoid, and my mind plays tricks on me, like seeing things in the corner of my eye and stuff. But this time I saw it in front of us, and all I saw were red, reflective eyes. I thought it was my mind messing with me, so I wasn't going to say anything to my friend, but then he said to me, "Hey, do you see that?" And I cut him off, telling him I did see it, and there was an immediate OSHT moment. We stood there, thinking about what we should do. As its eyes reflected off the lantern we brought, we saw it slightly moving, confirming that it was a very alive creature and not a sign or something. We tried to back up a bit, and then it turned its head so we couldn't see where it was anymore, so we did a very quick jog back towards the exit of the park, and about 3 minutes later, my friend stopped me and was staring at a tree behind us. I took a look, and it looked around 6 or 7 feet tall. It was on its hind legs, had an arm wrapped around the tree, and was peeking over at us with a human-like head, but we couldn't make out any facial features. A branch broke, and we ran further up. We were almost out, then right next to me, the bush rustled. I scream, and we do a full-on sprint back to the car, and we got the duck out. In July 2021, I was working at Summit Bechtel Reserve, in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. The staff camp was on a hill and overlooked the mountains, with both road and hiking trail access. The trail was seldom used, as it went deeper in the forest. One morning around 6:30 a.m., I decided to get a picture of the sun coming up over the mountain. I walked to the very edge of our cliff and watched the sun rise over the mountains. I heard something moving in the woods down the trail, turned to my left, and caught about 10 seconds of a large, dark figure moving along the tree line before vanishing into the forest. I took a picture of where the thing was later in the day. I must admit, I didn't get the closest look at it, being up the hill from it and it still being relatively dark. The thing was postured sort of the way a proud man walks, head up, shoulders back, and moving with purpose. It was walking away from me, so I couldn't see the face. If I had to guess a height, I'd say about 7 feet, given the fact that its head seemed to be even with the lowest branches on the trees, which were a good head taller than me, and I'm 5 feet 10 inches. It was a hot and humid summer day when I decided to go for a hike in the forest. I had hiked these trails countless times before, and I felt confident that I knew my way around. But as I was making my way deeper into the woods, I noticed that something felt off. The air was still and oppressive, and the birds and animals seemed to have gone quiet. I had a feeling that I was being watched, but I told myself it was just my imagination. As the sun began to set, I realized that I had lost my way. The trail I was following seemed to be leading me in circles, and I couldn't find any familiar landmarks. I pulled out my map and compass, but they were no help. The map was too old and didn't match the landscape, and the compass seemed to be malfunctioning. Panicked, I tried to retrace my steps, but it was no use. The trail was overgrown and barely visible, and I couldn't remember which direction I had come from. I sat down on a rock, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I knew I needed to come up with a plan, but my head was spinning. As the night fell, I started a fire and huddled next to it, trying to keep warm. I had brought a few supplies with me, but I knew they wouldn't last long. I had to find a way out of the forest before it was too late. As I was dozing off, I heard a rustling in the bushes. I sat up, my heart racing, and peered into the darkness. There was something there, watching me. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. I grabbed a branch and held it out in front of me, ready to defend myself. But as the rustling grew louder, I realized that whatever it was huge. Suddenly, a creature emerged from the shadows. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall and humanoid, but its skin was mottled and black, and its eyes glowed red. It had long, sharp claws and jagged teeth, and it was making a low, guttural growling sound. I screamed and swung the branch at it, but it was like hitting a brick wall. The creature didn't even flinch. It lunged at me, its claws outstretched. I dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. I knew I had to get out of there fast. I grabbed my backpack and started running, not stopping until I was out of breath. But no matter how fast I ran, the creature seemed to be right behind me. Its growls echoed through the forest, taunting me. I could feel its hot breath on my neck, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it caught up to me. Just when I thought it was the end, I saw a glimmer of light up ahead. It was a small cabin, nestled in a clearing. I ran towards it, hoping to find safety inside. But as I approached, I saw that the door was hanging off its hinges and the windows were broken. It was clear that no one had been there in a long time. But I had no other choice. I burst through the door and barricaded it behind me, panting and shaking. I searched the cabin for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. But all I could find was an old, rusted shovel. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I waded in. My friend was driving, and I was in the passenger seat. It was dark out, and the headlights only illuminated about 60 feet in front of us. Out of the darkness and in the middle of the street comes a giant wolf-like creature about the size and build of a bear. It was bulky, black, had a huge head, and had kind of spiky hair. Something like a cross between a bear and a wolf, but definitively not either. My friend slams on the brakes, and I push myself back in my seat, grip the armrests, and gasp. I still remember feeling my heart drop into my stomach. The thing ran straight towards us and just vanished, just as we would have hit it. We come to a screeching halt in the middle of the road and just sit there in silence for a second. After I get my breath back, I ask him if he stopped because of the wolf in the road, and he says yes. And I wasn't even sure that it happened until I said something. The whole event was over in about 5 seconds, and it still gives me the heebie-jeebies. I've not been able to convince myself that it didn't happen, but I don't have any good explanations either. Has anyone seen anything like this? I've always wondered. This happened a year ago, in the winter. Together with my brother, I went to the forest for a ride. It's quite strange that our vehicle started the first time, came on for a long time, stood in the garage, and was old. I didn't pay much attention to it. I was excited to drive on forest roads and hills. When we got there and drove a little, we met a man who was moving in a suspicious way and looking in our direction. The guy was quite skinny and did not pose a threat, so we thought. I thought it was a forest, and everyone has the right to go there. With us was my grandfather, who lit a bonfire nearby to bake sausages. It was both beautiful and terrible. We stopped at the bank of the river to cool down and drink for a while. During a brief moment of silence, my brother asked me, "Did you see what he had in his pocket?" Confused, I replied that I hadn't paid attention to it because I was driving. To this, he replied, "A gun." I wondered in horror what he could do to us if we provoked him. I would like this situation to end now. Imagine my horror when I realized that my grandfather was still in the forest. This time I asked my brother a question: where did we meet him? To this, he sadly replied that it was on the road leading to the camp. We decided to go back there and check if everything was okay. When we were already on the 200-meter road to the camp, it started to get dark sharply. We sped up. My heart skipped when I saw this man running straight towards my grandfather's camp. At this point, my brother took over the steering wheel and, with a stony expression on his face, accelerated. When we were at my grandfather's car, I quickly got off the quad and ran to inform him about the guy from the forest. He, too, was speechless, but calmly got into the car in cold blood and told us to follow him. The only road from there led through the forest, only there could the car pass. We moved quickly in that direction, leaving the other campers in fear. When we managed to leave the forest, my grandfather announced that he would call the police. You may not believe me, but it was the most horrible experience of my life. It was a moonless night, deep in the heart of a dense forest. I was camping with a group of friends, seeking adventure and a break from the monotony of everyday life. Little did we know that our desire for excitement would lead us into a nightmare beyond our wildest imagination. As we sat around the campfire, exchanging ghost stories and laughter, a sense of unease washed over me. The forest seemed to hold its breath, an eerie stillness settling upon the land. It was then that a distant howl pierced through the night, sending shivers down our spines. Uneasiness turned to fear as we realized we were not alone. Eyes darted through the trees, catching glimpses of shadowy figures lurking just beyond the fire's glow. Whispers of dread filled the air as the unsettling truth dawned upon us: we were being watched by the dreaded Skinwalkers. Legends spoke of these supernatural beings, shapeshifters who could assume the form of any animal. They possessed dark magic and were said to be cursed souls, trapped between the realms of the human and the animal. The forest became their hunting ground, and we were their unwitting prey. As the night wore on, the Skinwalkers grew bolder, taunting us with their eerie calls and glimpses of twisted forms. Their haunting voices echoed through the trees, mimicking the cries of lost loved ones and driving us to the edge of sanity. We were trapped in a living nightmare, our fates teetering on a precarious edge. In a desperate attempt to escape, we fled through the forest, our hearts pounding with fear. But no matter how fast we ran, the Skinwalkers matched our pace, their unnerving presence always at our heels. It was as if they were toying with us, reveling in our terror. Hours turned into eternity as we stumbled deeper into the heart of the forest, our minds teetering on the brink of madness. The trees seemed to twist and contort, their branches reaching out like bony fingers, eager to snatch us away. The very air grew heavy with malevolence, suffocating our hopes of survival. Just as hope began to fade, we stumbled upon an ancient stone circle, a relic from a forgotten time. With no other options left, we huddled within its protective embrace, praying for salvation. The skinwalkers circled us, their glowing eyes fixated on our trembling forms. Their whispers filled the air, a cacophony of ancient languages and dark incantations. But then, as if by some miraculous intervention, a brilliant light pierced through the darkness, banishing the skinwalkers from our presence. A figure emerged, clad in radiant armor, wielding a sword that shimmered with otherworldly power. It was a guardian of light, sent to vanquish the evil that had plagued our souls. The guardian fought valiantly, striking down the skinwalkers with each swing of their blade. Their power was unmatched, and the creatures retreated into the shadows, their malevolence subdued. With a final nod, the guardian vanished, leaving us in awe of their heroic presence. We emerged from the forest, forever changed by our encounter with the skinwalkers. The horrors we had witnessed would stay etched in our memories, a reminder of the thin veil between the ordinary world and the realm of the supernatural. We had survived, but the chilling realization remained: the world was not as safe as we once believed. So heed my warning, dear listeners, and tread cautiously in the depths of nature's embrace. For there are forces that defy comprehension, lurking in the shadows, ready to ensnare those who dare to venture too far. The skinwalkers are real, and their presence serves as a chilling reminder that darkness can lurk even in the most serene of places. This story took place a few months ago with two of my friends. It was about 4 a.m, and me and my friends were in this small abandoned cabin in the woods in front of my house. We were smoking weed in there, like we always did. We were listening to music and having a good time when one of my friends turned down the music and said, "I'm not trying to sound paranoid or anything, but I just heard someone yell, and I saw the flash of a flashlight." At first, I thought he was just high and paranoid, but I still took what he said seriously. So we turned the music off and sat there for a few seconds. That's when we started hearing some rustling in some leaves. At first, I just thought it was rain falling off the leaves of the trees since it had just rained, but then it started getting louder. The sound got louder and louder until it turned into distinct footsteps. We all completely froze. It was 4 a.m, and no one should have been in the forest. The footsteps got louder and louder until we heard them just outside of the cabin. We heard the footsteps continue to walk around for a few minutes. We didn't move a muscle and didn't make a single sound until we heard the footsteps begin to walk off and fade into the distance. After a few minutes of being in shock and continuing to stay still, we decided that the coast was clear, so we packed up all our stuff. We got up and grabbed some sticks to use as weapons, just in case. We got out of the woods as fast as we could and went to go into my house. Once we got onto my property, we noticed that on my front lawn there was a huge branch that had fallen right where we had walked by earlier. It wasn't there when we came out 45 minutes earlier. Once we saw that, we all got a bad feeling in our guts. Immediately after that, I started to hear more footsteps coming from the back of my house. We all immediately took off down my street and didn't look back. Once we got to the end of my street, we stopped to catch our breaths. That's when, from down my street, we heard a horrific screaming sound. I can't even describe the sound we heard. It sounded like a crazy person screaming at the top of their lungs, but it also sounded non-human-like. We were all absolutely terrified. We continued to run until we were far enough away that we knew we were safe. After a while of just waiting around, we decided that it was safe to go back to my house. We were able to make it inside safely without seeing or hearing anything else. When we woke up the next day, we went back outside. We went to the tree where the branch had fallen. What we saw still gives me shivers to this day. On the tree, there were knife markings all over it. To this day, I still don't know who it was or what they would have done if they caught us. But honestly, I really don't want to know. This took place last year, in early November. I was exploring Fish Creek National Park, and I wasn't too far out from where I could hear cars and see their headlights. As the sun steadily began fading, I decided to head for a clearing devoid of trees and all life except for an old, lifeless oak, so I could call my boyfriend so I wouldn't get scared in the park alone. I did call him, but I wasn't in tune with the call. The tree was riddled with carvings and symbols, a bowl, and some herbs with broken glass and hair. Snap, a twig broke, alerting me to the dim sky and no longer lifeless field. A coyote, a very strange coyote that looked broken on every bone, decayed flesh filled my nostrils despite the distance between us. I decided it was feral and needed to get away from it, so I began to run towards the sounds of cars and headlights while trying to explain what had happened to my boyfriend on the phone. I had been running for a minute when I stopped by a patch of dense bush. I stopped because they were plastered with posters of missing people, but the hill leading to the main road was right beyond the bush, so in my moment of horror movie main character decision making, I walked through it only to be greeted by a standing teepee made of real recent animal hide still dripping in red. I was curious, so I looked inside and found a massive pile of raw, rotten, and fresh flesh or dead animal carcasses. I got the hell out of there and never went back. This is a story I really need to get off my chest and share because I tried to talk to my family, I tried to talk with the police, and even the forest rangers, but nobody even listens to me because they think I'm delusional or crazy, and it's just infuriating, but I'm going to tell you my story whether you believe it or not. This whole thing happened around 3 years ago. I lived in a town in Montana that's near some woodlands. And occasionally I like to hike those woods on the weekends just to get out of the house and get in tune with nature or something like that. On a pretty boring weekend, I decided to do some light hiking, so I got my supplies ready. I usually tend to start around 9 in the morning and try to get back close to 4 in the afternoon. I tend to travel the same path, but on this particular day, I was apparently feeling adventurous. So I decided to travel a different path instead, and things were going pretty well. While on my trek, I started to smell something rancid. Eventually, I stumbled upon a large heap of something that was dead. And when I got closer, it was the carcass of a bear. And from my knowledge, it looked like a grizzly because the fur was more of a brown color and it was pretty big. The carcass was eviscerated and covered, with chunks of flesh missing and deep gashes. And not to mention all of the flies that were swarming it. Obviously, I was taken aback by this because I've never seen anything this pulverized before, so I was gagging at the sight and smell of the dead mass. And while I was looking at the heap, I heard something that kind of sounded like a guttural, chirping noise. It was almost like something was chuckling at me when I saw this. So when I heard this, I quickly turned around, and I didn't see anything. And not even 2 seconds after I turned around, I started to hear a dragging noise. Then I turned around again, and I still can't even fathom what I saw. I see the carcass being dragged by an emaciated, pale, long arm that looked around 10 feet in length. And what that arm was attached to was a thing that had the head of a wolf with antlers. It was on its haunches and had no hair, from what I could tell. And also, not to mention, this thing was covered up by a cloak of some sort. But the more I looked, the more disturbing it got. The cloak was made of flesh and viscera, I could even see blood dripping off of it. I noticed that the cloak had different patches of flesh and fur, some of the patches looked fresh, and some were black due to rot. And the stench, oh God, the stench, it was just sensory overload. And when I saw this abomination, it turned its head so nonchalantly, stared at me with its golden eyes, and started to make that chuckling noise again. Me and the thing just stared at each other for way too long, and I couldn't handle it anymore. I turned around and started to run. I didn't even think to scream. While I was running, I stupidly turned my head around, and it was still looking at me. Then the thing just threw its head back and started cackling. So that made me run even faster and harder than I ever ran in my life. Nothing bad happened to me while I was running. Actually, it was really quiet when I started down that new trail, which I should have realized at the time. Everything that just happened only started to sink in when I got back home, and once that realization kicked in, I just couldn't handle it anymore, so I started to scream and freak out. It took me a week to just get out of the house. I actually almost lost my job, but I made up some excuses. I've come to terms with it and even made a name for it, Armsy. But after that experience, I got out of that state as soon as possible. I've been living in Idaho for 2 years now and have gotten a better job, so things are going pretty well for me right now. But I want to warn people who are living in Montana that that thing is still out there in those woods, so please be careful out there. Last year, I decided to have a girls' day with my friends. This was in April 2021, so we couldn't do much but make some baked goods and sit around talking about work and school. I really wanted to visit the woods behind my house, so I originally planned to bring all the food we made to the woods and hang out there, but unfortunately, when the day came, it was just implausible. It was cold and supposed to rain. Plus, it was a good 25-minute walk across a mucky, barren field, so I thought it was best to have the food at my house and visit the woods afterwards. I feel it's important to mention that I've never actually been to the woods behind my house, so I didn't really know what to expect. I liked the spooky aspect of it, so I was really interested. After snacks and chatting, my friends and I threw on whatever shoes I could find around my house that were suitable for walking across a field. We hopped my fence and set off. Walking there was kind of unsettling, and I was kind of scared that my friends and I would get the cops called on us for some reason. One of my friends, let's call her B, was getting a little scared, and so was I. It just felt kind of wrong what we were doing. I can't explain that feeling, it's like you just know something's off. My other friends were goofing off while B and I were pissing our pants. When we finally got to the woods, I was kind of amazed. There was no clear path, and it looked like no one had stepped foot in the woods for over 100 years. There was a huge tree that had fallen down and was covered in moss. It looked so untouched and beautiful that it was almost otherworldly. We didn't go very far into the woods, maybe 30 meters, about 100 feet, in. Nothing felt off. After about 15 minutes, we decided to head back as it was starting to get dark out. As we walked, I started to get that uneasy feeling again, but I assumed it was because we were in the middle of an empty field surrounded by nothing but the forest behind us. B nudged me and pointed out a tree that looked a bit like a face and said she felt like something was watching us. I told her I did feel uneasy as well, so let's just go as quickly as we could back to my house. After we made it back, all was well. We chatted again for a couple more hours before everyone went home, and nothing felt off. Cue me writing this a year and a half later. I haven't been out much this summer, but last night there was a pretty sunset, so I decided to sit at the edge of the pool and walk around my backyard. I decided to hop the back fence to look out at the field again for a bit of nostalgia. As I turned around to look out the window, I noticed someone standing about 150 meters away from me. The person was dressed in brown and black, and I thought it was my neighbor for a second, so I started to wave my hand at him, which I promptly stopped. The person was way taller than my neighbor, and even though my vision isn't too good, the person was also ghostly pale. Now, I'm not totally stupid. Instead of running up to the person, I took my phone out and zoomed in to take a picture. I only took one before the person saw me and started walking towards me. Slowly, my camera on my phone stopped working, and I climbed the fence as fast as I could. I turned around to hop down into my yard. I saw its face. It looked like the tree B had pointed out last year, and it was less than 5 meters away from me. It was walking so slowly, I didn't hear any running. How did it catch up to me so quickly? I backed away from the fence so quickly, I didn't want to turn my back on the thing that was behind me. Then I heard it. Its voice was lower than a whisper, just barely audible, and was coming from all directions. 1 step every night since the woods. 20 steps if I see you. I ran back inside to go tell my parents, but I didn't know what to tell them. What if it saw them? What would it do? The only person I talked to was B. I sent her the picture, only for her to send me a question mark in response. There's nothing in the picture. What do you mean there's something standing right there? I can see it. I clicked on the picture and zoomed in on it. How could she not see it? She was there with me that day. Then it moved. In the picture. Shit. I can see it. About 6 years ago, my cousin, my friend, and I were all walking in the woods for what felt like an hour, which was normal because we did it almost every day and knew the woods very well. Well, as we get to a big opening, we see a big barn and people outside working. They all stop and see us working and start looking at us, waving us over, but we all took off the other way. About 5 minutes of running, and we were back where we entered. We had never seen a barn or anything any other time we entered, so the next day we all went back and got to the exact place we were when we saw it, but there was just a fence with a no trespassing sign. No barn, no hay bales. Nothing. Just a field and woods. All of us still remember it to this day but haven't seen the place since. Did I go to another universe or what? Because it freaked me out and still does. My friends and I used to camp a lot in the El Dorado National Forest. We had a spot along Sapiago Springs where we used to camp a lot. One weekend, we decided to go to a 3-day foraging camp. We brought in MREs in case we couldn't find anything, some guns, and some supplies to set up shelter, but that's about it. The first night was chill. We cooked a bunch of crawdads and a squirrel my buddy shot, drank a few beers we'd brought, and slept fine. The next day, something felt off to me. One of my friends who was with me and I had had some really creepy experiences in this part of the forest in the past, and it felt a bit like those. The forest was dead silent, and you felt like something was watching you. I grew up in the woods, so I know the signs of a predator, but this felt different than a bear or a mountain lion. When night fell, my friends went 200 yards or so up the stream to do some stuff, and I was alone in camp. The feeling got even stronger, so I built up the fire nice and big and grabbed a gun. I kept hearing faint voices from the woods in the opposite direction of where my friends went. They were low, indistinct sounds, but they were creeping me out majorly, and my buddies had taken the only 2 flashlights, poor planning in hindsight. As I peered out into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of something moving 50 yards or so out in the trees. I snapped the rifle to my shoulder and got the scope on it. It was pretty dark, and the only light was from the fire, but I could see the outline of what I was aiming at. It looked human but was on all fours, and its arms seemed a lot longer than they should. It stood a bit like an ape but was very low to the ground. I only saw it for a second before it loped off deeper into the woods. After I lost track of it, I'd hear light rustling in different directions around the camp, leaves scuffling, and the occasional twig breaking. Always away from where my friends went, in the 180% on the other side of the camp from their departure. I got the sense that whatever it was stalking me. I kept the fire high and was staying sharp, looking out into the woods, but I didn't see it again. My buddies came back about 10 minutes later to find me a paranoid wreck glassing the tree line with the scope. I told them what happened, and they got quiet, then told me the reason they came back when they did was because they started hearing the same shit I did over by where they were, and it spooked them. We spent the second night of our trip with a big-ass fire and 3 lookouts. Nobody slept that night. In the morning, we broke camp as quick as we could and hightailed it out of there. We never camped in that spot again. About a week or so ago, my boyfriend and I went out at around 9:30 or 10 p.m. to go herping, looking for salamanders, frogs, and such. We went to a path adjacent to the university I attend, popped our headlamps on, and went on our way. On the right side of this path is a wetland or swampy area, and on the left side there's a pretty dense forest. Around an hour into our walk, I saw the lights. There were 2 of them, sort of diagonally placed from each other near the left side of the path. They were super bright and had a yellowish tinge to them. They were at least 25 feet away from us, and my boyfriend noticed them too. They hung around in that spot for about 30 seconds before they darted into the forest. Much too big to be fireflies or bugs, and definitely not other people also sporting headlamps because we kept walking and didn't pass anyone else. A few minutes later, we passed these 2 reflective signs. I thought that our headlamps bouncing off of them could have been the source of the lights. After that, we kept walking. About 10 minutes later, we see the lights again, but this time further away. The same thing happens, they hang around before darting into the forest. We walked a few more minutes, but I didn't notice any more signs. It was at that point that I was hit with this cold feeling, and I had a gut feeling that we should turn around and go back to the car, which we did, although I do wish we had kept going, just to see what would have happened. If anyone has had similar experiences or has any ideas or explanations, I would love to hear them. Me and some of my family went camping for a little family gathering. This was the start of the pandemic, and I was glad to finally get out of the house and get some fresh air. Being 18 at the time, I was also glad to not be in school as well. As we neared the camping site, I had gotten my stuff ready. I wasn't really going to sleep in a tent because I wanted to hear and see nature and its animals, so I brought my hammock to hang from the trees, and this happened to be a mistake that I will regret later. The first night was amazing. I saw a few deer and later a few wolves that were hunting them. Luckily, I was super high up, but I was just in awe either way. The next day, I wanted to explore some trails and see if I could see some more animals, but after exploring for a few hours and staying on the trails, of course, I decided to go back. I didn't really see any animals, so I was kind of bummed out. When I was walking back, I noticed how quiet everything was, no birds, no anything, and I was wondering what was happening. I heard a ton of birds and stuff on the way up, but now nothing. I admit I was a bit creeped out because, without the sounds of the forest, it was just a giant empty space. I thought I'd maybe scared everything off, and that's what I went with at first, and that kind of put my mind at ease, but I still couldn't get over it. As I got back to the site, everything kind of just returned, the birds and other sounds of the forest, and also that fear. Maybe I was being stalked by something, and that's why everything went silent, or it could have been my head. I didn't know at that point, so I warned my family that there might be a bear up there or something. The rest of the day went well. Me and my dad went fishing in a river, caught a few fish, and made dinner. As the sun went down, we sat around the fire, eating hot dogs, fish, and s'mores, talking about life and the pandemic. When we all heard fast footsteps going around the site and strange noises also coming from where the footsteps were, it sounded kind of unnatural, like a person, but not at the same time. It got a bit closer but then sprinted away, screaming 3 nearly identical screams. It was super fast, like ungodly fast. My family thought it was probably an animal, but I was super unnerved by the experience, so we went to bed, but I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing footsteps slowly walking around the camp, and that same inhuman noise was followed by clicking. I finally managed to sleep once it walked away again. In the morning, I decided not to leave the campsite and let the others hike. I just split firewood to make a fire and made breakfast. After they got back, they told me about the lack of sounds that way, and I talked about my experience the day before. Now I knew something was going on and we were going to stay another night, so I got scared, so that night I took an extra blanket and hid away in my hammock. I didn't hear anything but my family at the barely lit fire telling stories, but then I heard a snap above me and peeked out and saw something with long-ass arms and yellowish eyes and patchy hairless skin crawling down the tree above me and making those noises I've heard so many times, and it smelled of death, but it seems my family noticed it and chucked a stone at it, causing it to jump down and sprint away, making those 3 identical screams as it did. We hightailed it out of there the next day, and I've never been at that site again. The woods can be a beautiful yet terrifying place, you don't know what will come from them. This is one of my favorite experiences to tell because I believe I may have run into a skinwalker or something like it. About 5 years ago, my friend and I were walking through her neighborhood back to her house. It wasn't late, but it was winter, so it was starting to get dark around 5 or 6 p.m. to get to her house. We had to walk down a huge hill with many streets on it, which is confusing as all hell if you aren't familiar with the area. Anyway, we walked down a street where we had to turn right to continue on our route. Left was a dead end. As we neared the end of this particular street, a large animal of some sort went hurtling from right, the direction we were going to go, to left, the direction of the dead end. We both stopped and stared at each other, and I do not remember the look of pure horror on her face. It looked like a dog, but it was ducking huge. I've never seen a dog that big in my life. Whatever it was, it ran on all fours and at an incredibly fast pace. Terrified, we had no choice but to take this route, as it was the only way to get back to her house. We approached the street with caution and both went in opposing directions to look for clues as to what the duck just happened. We searched under the light of the streetlights for about 10 minutes, under cars, down garden pathways, literally everywhere. No people were around, so no one was walking their dog. No one whistled or called anything out, so it wasn't like an owner was waiting at their front door and letting the creature inside. It literally just disappeared into thin ducking air, which was more unbelievable because of how big it was. We ended up scaring ourselves with theories and running the rest of the way back to her house. I live in the mountains in Northern California, and the drive to my house is about 45 minutes from town on a windy road. There are a few landmarks that, when I pass them, I know I'm almost home. It is around 3 p.m. when I pass the Yuba River, which means I'm about 10 minutes from my house. I keep driving, and suddenly the trees in the forest that surround the road look unfamiliar. I keep driving, expecting to see the turnoff to my house. I don't see it, I keep driving, and suddenly I'm at the hot springs an hour north of my house on the same road, but I never pass the gas station, convenience store, or any of the other landmarks. It was all just trees. It was also now sunset, and 10 minutes earlier it had been 3 p.m. Back when I was in college, probably 2012 to 2013, I experienced something weird with my friend. I went to a community college in New Jersey, and I met a lot of friends. One night, 2 guys that I didn't know very well but who seemed cool wanted to chill. I'll call them Rourke and Eric. I drove the 3 of us to Eric's house for video games, movies, and for Rourke and me to spend the night. We were having fun, but around 2 a.m., Eric's dad inexplicably just said that Rourke and I couldn't spend the night. This was annoying because my place was at least a 45-minute drive away, and I would need to drive Rourke home first, wherever that was. This part of the state is very rural, with a bunch of thick forest roads and farmland, so everything is far apart there. So begrudgingly, Rourke and I got into my car, and since Eric guided us to his place and neither Rourke nor I knew where we were, I would need to GPS to his house. At the time, I still had a slider phone, not a smartphone, so I used one of those old TomTom GPS units. We started on our way, following the GPS's instructions through the wooded roads, making small talk, and whatnot. Before long, we ended up on a wooded road that the GPS didn't have a name for. The space for the road name was just blank, which I had never seen before. Less than a minute after we got on the road, the GPS lost signal. I didn't think much of it and just continued, figuring it would come back. The road started off normal and unremarkable, but it gradually got steeper and steeper downhill. Rourke and I commented on it but brushed it off. However, as the minutes passed, the road got more and more simple. Eventually there were no guardrails, then it stopped having streetlights, then it became a dirt road with no markings, and then it narrowed for just enough space for a car one way. The forest on either side was hugging us, and aside from the dirt road, there were no signs of human influence. It's also worth noting that there was never an intersecting road to turn onto. It was a lonely road. We also never saw another car. Rourke and I were kind of nervously laughing about it, trying not to freak out. The decline had become very steep, and it was almost a perfectly straight road. I had considered trying to turn around, but at that point the road was too narrow to turn around, and it would have been awful for my car to drive back up something so steep for so long. So we just descended into the darkness, only able to see what my headlights showed. All in all, we probably went down for 15 to 20 minutes, and we were going decently fast. I doubt we went below 20 miles per hour, much faster a lot of the time, so that I wasn't killing my brake pads. I feel as though we should have easily passed sea level. Eventually the road evened out, guardrails and streetlights came back, the GPS signal returned, and we just ended up on some side road, like 2 minutes from Rourke's place. He insists that the road had never been there, and there was no mountain near his place for us to descend. I ended up just crashing at Rourke's place. The next day, I drove back the way I came and could not find the strange road, nor could I find any road that was remarkably elevated. A couple of days ago, my boyfriend and I went camping in eastern Germany. We had found an incredible spot to set up our tent, right by a river in the woods. We parked the car about 20 meters away from us, behind a bush. After we set everything up, we sat by the river and enjoyed the sun setting. It was getting darker, and we could hear the animals around us getting more active. We were well aware that we would hear some creepy noises at night. Anyway, my boyfriend decided to bring our food to the car to not attract any more animals at night. I stayed at our spot, enjoying the view. As soon as he walked to the car, this strange feeling got to me. A feeling of fear and alertness. I kept checking on my boyfriend, who jokingly said something like, "Please keep looking after me," which is also untypical for him. Maybe it's worth mentioning that neither he nor I are easily scared. We are both tough and had a knife with us, too. When he got back to our spot, he kneeled down next to me and said, "I heard something really heavy walking in those woods." I thought he was joking, trying to scare me, but he was serious, and I could see how uneasy he was. He said we should have a look with the knife and flashlights, so we did. About halfway to the car, I could hear it, too. Some really heavy footsteps. First I thought, oh well, a deer, but not soon after I noticed that it clearly sounded like bipedal footsteps. In that moment, I got chills and felt an insane moment of panic. We stood there, frozen, staring into the woods. When we moved, it moved. When we stood still, it stood still. It clearly mocked our steps. That went on for 2 minutes. We've had enough. I rushed back to the tent as my boyfriend stood guard with the knife on hold. I grabbed everything valuable and necessary, and we rushed to the car. As I grabbed the stuff, I could still hear it moving in the bushes. As soon as we were in the car, we locked the door and drove off to gain some distance. We parked the car in a parking lot and talked about what just happened. My boyfriend said that when he brought the food to the car, he already had a weird gut feeling of something or someone lurking, the reason for him asking me to keep checking on him. As soon as he heard the steps, he said he literally got chills down his whole spine. He also saw some sort of vague outline of something but couldn't identify anything. He's never felt more altered and panicked his whole life, and neither did I. It was pure survival and gut instincts to get away from whatever was in the bush. We slept in the car that night. Now he thinks it was a creepy human who was up to no good. I think that is a possibility, but that it might be something different. Do you guys have any ideas of what it might have been like to be apart from a human? We do not have any large predators in Germany, only wolves, which are rare and not bipedal. A little weird experience here that I actually forgot about for many years. For 6th grade camp, the year was 2004, I went to a place called Palomar Mountains in California. Of course, most of my time there was fun, lots of scary stories, and lots of activities. One night, about 3 cabins were taken outside for some scary stories by the campfire. My cabin, of course, is included in this. I was sitting next to my friend, and we were towards the back of the entire group. I was really into the scary story the counselor was telling when, all of a sudden, my friend nudged me. She says, "Hey, something is above us." I look up above us with her when we see this big, giant, round plane in the sky. I say plane because once I looked at it, I could hear it make noise. This noise was sort of like a jet flying over. This big round plane had a few lights underneath it, and it was about 3 to 4 football fields across. It was pretty close to us, and by that, I meant it was right above the trees. It was moving very, very slowly. It did not turn but just glided past. I looked down to see if everyone was looking. The weird thing was that when I looked down, I couldn't hear the jet noise, and I realized only about 15 of us were looking up while everyone else was listening to the story being told by the counselor. I looked back up, and I heard the jet noise again. As I am watching the plane start to leave and be out of sight, I think, wow, we need to tell everyone and figure out what this is. Finally, as the plane leaves our sight, the jet noise cuts off, and we look back down towards the counselor. To this day, I have no idea why, but we did not bring it up. There was no discussion about it. We just went back to listening to the last story, got up, and went back to the cabin. I actually forgot about this for about 5 years until I was talking about UFOs with my family, and all of a sudden this memory came back like a tidal wave. I was able to ask my friend if she remembered this as well, and she does. She also doesn't know why we didn't talk about it or why she didn't remember it until I reminded her about it. My uncle joked that we must have been abducted. Sometimes I wonder if we were. So when I was about 11, my mom decided to move me and my brothers from Richmond, Virginia, to a little town called Colonial Heights, better known as Colonial Whites, because of its history of being a sundown town whose residents used to consist of nothing but white people for decades until about the 60s or 70s, as well as being very open about its local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. I wish I was kidding, but no, look that shit up, dog. Anyway, I moved to this place, meet some guys, and basically become like a group of friends who did everything together. We would frequently meet up on the railroad tracks because that was how we got around and was a good hangout place because you didn't have to walk directly on the tracks as there were side paths, which in turn also had little offshoot paths to different parts of neighborhoods or streets. From time to time, I would experience some weird and strange things on these tracks or very close by. It was as if maybe something was out there with us, watching, waiting. People in the town and the adjoining small village may often use these tracks for travel or to hang out, so it's not out of the ordinary to see or hear certain things, but sometimes I have no explanation for what I experience. One particular day, I was walking these tracks to get to a path that led beside a friend's house. I was about 11 or 12, and I remember walking along the track. I was far enough from the main road and any of the paths that led directly to a neighborhood, so if I had to run from a dog, I would probably be ducked. It's about 11 a.m., as I wanted to get there early enough to hang for a couple of hours. As I am walking on the tracks, I begin to hear leaves crunching from the forest area, and the woods aren't dense, so you can see a lot of open area. I peer into the forest, and I see nothing. I shrug it off as a bird, but as soon as I start walking again, the leaves start crunching again. So me, overthinking, looks down to see if I'm stepping on leaves that are in the tracks, and to my surprise, there are no leaves, just rocks, metal, and wood, and believe me, that's a whole different sound when you are walking. I stop and start again, and so do the leaves crunching from the forest area on my left, which is also the side of the path that's a ways up ahead that leads to my friend's house. So I say duck it and ducking take off. As I'm running, I'm thinking in my head that it's probably nothing, and I'm tripping until, out of the corner, my eye can see leaves in the forest area moving, and my brain automatically says, hey man, even though you clearly didn't see a damn thing, just imagine it's a dog. News flash. It wasn't a dog. I don't know what the duck it was. Now that I think about it, it reminds me of that scene in Evil Dead where the camera is rushing through the forest. As I get closer to the path I have to take, I get scared for my life because, as I said earlier, there wasn't anything there, but there was something moving, and it was moving fast. Finally, I get to the path and turn into it, and as I ran, I could hear whatever was behind me as if it were taunting me. It had the power to take me at any moment, but it didn't. It was toying with me. I get to where the house is, which is located to the right on the path I am taking. As I get closer, I hear it move back into the forest and move a bit away. I broke off the path and ran up the steps to the front door. My friend opens the door, looks at me, and asks if I ran and if I was okay. I said yes and was skeptical that he wouldn't believe me. I said I was chased by a dog or something, and he responded that there was a family of foxes that the mother was very protective of, and I just said yeah, maybe, but deep down I knew it wasn't foxes. I've seen those foxes he was talking about before, and what I saw or didn't see was not that. Whatever it was didn't want me that day. I was new to the area, and I was in its territory, and it wanted me to be aware, I believe. It sounds crazy until you learn about the town's history. I live in a massive subdivision that surrounds a bunch of woods affectionately referred to as the trails. I suppose the people who own it left it untouched in case they wanted to add more streets. This happened back when I was about 17 to 19 years old. I had just gotten off work and had gone to grab some fast food. My friends had called me earlier, letting me know we were going to meet at Bear Cave. So after I got home, I changed into some warmer clothes, as this was late fall to early winter and it had been unusually cold that night. So I decided I should get out there as soon as possible and decided to take my food with me and eat there. Now, it's about 8:30 and the moon is barely visible through the trees, but knowing the trail like the back of my hand, I wasn't worried and assumed they would already have a fire started. As I approached, I walked up to our hidden entrance and saw there was no fire and heard no sounds. I took my phone out and texted one, asking where they were. They replied something along the lines of, sorry, man, we're going to be about 15 minutes. Great. I thought to myself. I dove in and started trying to scrape together some wood and kindling to get something started. Unfortunately, everything was wet, and without a proper flashlight, this was before they were standard on phones, I couldn't get into the brush and dig anything up. Soon after, I decided I might as well eat and hurriedly scarfed down my 2 burgers. Before I knew it, I had been sitting out there for about 20 minutes and still saw no sign of anyone. I tried giving a couple of them a call, and after 5 minutes with no call back, I texted them. Still no response. At this point, I was about fed up and my phone was about to die, so I made a mental note, 10 more minutes and I am gone. At this point, I squatted down, holding my knees to my chest, and tried getting warm. My back was to our little hut at the back of the site. I thought I heard something behind me, a slight crunch. I looked over my shoulder, and from behind the shelter, I saw what looked like two beady eyes glinting from the little moonlight entering through the trees. I quickly and quietly turned my full body to face it. At this point, I feel as though I am about to throw up or shit myself. But keeping my mind about myself, I slowly reached to my right, where I had laid a stick, just in case something like this might happen. If this was a dog, it was big. And let me just clarify, this was not a wolf, as I live in the south and coyotes do not get this big. Something wasn't right. It just stared unblinkingly, as if through me, and made no sound whatsoever. I realized that whatever this was, it wanted to come at me. Thinking fast, I decided my best interest was to throw it off guard. I threw the stick, and without seeing if it made contact, I turned and ran swiftly out the entrance, expertly placing my feet in all the safe places through the trail, assuring I wouldn't trip while maintaining maximum speed. I didn't stop till I saw street lights and was safely on the road. About this time, I see my friends pulling up, and all I tell them is that I saw something. They didn't seem too interested and tried to go out. I told them sternly no and suggested we just go to my house. This seemed suitable to them, and so we went. I still don't know what I saw out there, and it was as though everyone forgot about it. I continued to go back out there, but only during the day or at night with a friend. But I will never forget those unwavering eyes. My mom's boyfriend. To start off, he is Nepali and grew up near the Himalayan mountains. This is where the story takes place, and the whole time he is telling me his tale, his eyes are so big like saucers, and he's speaking in a terrified tone. Near his house in Nepal, there is a huge open field that apparently no one ever walks in because of superstition. His grandmother has seen numerous lights and orbs running through the field at breakneck speeds. Even their oxen won't go into this field. As kids, they were heavily advised not to go into the field, and they weren't taught to fear it, rather, it's just forbidden to go there. So one evening, around 3 p.m., he gets into an argument with his father because he doesn't want to help paint the house, he wants to play. And his father tells him no, so gonna call him H, says some disrespectful shit and runs off. He doesn't pay attention to where he's going and ends up walking along this stream to sit. H sits there for a few moments, staring at the stream to collect his thoughts, and suddenly whacks on the back of his head. Now he's sitting under a small tree, so he assumes it's just a branch, or maybe a bird or something hit him. So he turns and sees nothing, ignoring it. Then it happens again and again, getting progressively harder. He gets scared and gets up, running away from whatever it was that was hitting him. But as he's running, as fast as his legs can carry him, something is still smacking him on the back of his head. So he turned to look, and this is where his voice trembled, and there were large humanoid, disembodied pale legs chasing him. He told me that every time he tried to look up to see its face, it would slap him harder. Eventually he runs to his home and says, "Mom. Dad," and passes the duck out. He was drenched in sweat and exhausted. He ended up sleeping 14 plus hours. His parents told him that he was gone for 4 hours in what seemed to him to be just 1 hour. And he had come running from the direction of the forbidden field. This really wigs me out every time I think about it. I live in Georgia, the state, in a rural town not too far from a major city. There's a set of woods that's behind our house, and it divides two neighborhoods. It's about a mile wide. Strange occurrences have always surrounded these woods. Small things like random trash, tarps, etc. I should mention it's more swampy marsh than woods, so camping there is impossible. One night, I was taking our dog out. He stays in the back half of the house because he does not like the other dogs. I took him out the side door and walked around the house to the fence. For some reason, when we left the house, he was absolutely terrified. He didn't want to go out, which is very unusual for a dog who's quick to snatch someone's soul if prompted. Not thinking about it, we pushed onward. After he tinkled, we walked back. This is when I noticed it, or rather, heard it. Crunching of leaves. At first, I thought it was one of our dozen cats on the property until I realized it was matching my steps. If I walked, you could hear me walking. If I stopped, it stopped. There's a small clearing between the woods where one of the sheds is. That's when we saw it. My dog was first to see something, and then I saw some. I dunno. Creature? It was taller than the shed, so maybe a good 8 feet tall, and it darted across the clearing at a crazy fast speed. My dog, who again isn't scared of anything, bolted so fast that I dropped his leash, and he ran to the door, whining. I was quickly behind him. Once we were inside, I quickly bolted the door and ran to tell my girlfriend what happened. She immediately wanted to investigate, saying it's probably a woodland creature. Armed with 2 flashlights, we went out the front door. As we walked towards the wood line, we could hear something moving around. It sounded maybe 200 yards away. As we scanned with our flashlights, we saw nothing but kept hearing it. Then we heard it get closer and closer until it was maybe 20 feet away. Still nothing. No eyes, not even an animal call. Just rustling. My girlfriend is now scared for the house. I decided to check with the neighbors to see if maybe one of their many dogs got out. When I arrived at his house, my neighbor, whom we'll call Dave, explained that all his dogs were accounted for. Curious, he came to investigate. This is when I noticed that whatever this thing was, it followed me along the wood line to Dave's house and was now behind Dave's house. With a gun in hand, we went into his backyard, scanning for something. We could hear it rustling or maybe running. About 100 yards away in thick swampy woods. Way too thick for a person to walk in, let alone run in. Then it stopped. It was dead silent. Scanning and on edge, we hear and see nothing, and then, bam, all of a sudden, it was 5 feet in front of us sprinting at me. It slammed the fence so hard that it rocked it back and forth. Dave, scared shitless, shot randomly at well. Nothing. We never saw it, never let it get close to us. Again, as I mentioned, the woods are thick. It was too thick to run in, so the duck teleported silently in front of us and slammed the gate. Spooked, we were about to run. Then we heard it. It was human in nature, but not English. It sounded alien-like? It is not a known language. Dave, a hunter for the last 40 years still to this day, can't explain what that was. Anyway, after we heard that, we bolted. He covered me, and I ran to my house. Not 10 minutes later, we both hear a loud explosion coming from the woods. It shook our houses and flickered our power. I ran outside to see what it was, and of course nothing, but when Dave came out and confirmed he felt the same thing, we were both once again terrified. Moments later, a few strangers from the neighborhood came driving down to our cul-de-sac, and they all agreed that the blast sound they heard came from behind our house. 911 was called, and the 2 police officers interviewed us separately. Our stories match. The responding officers refused to go anywhere near those woods. They took the report and left. To this day, we're still not sure what that encounter was. Also, Dave doesn't go outside at night anymore. It spooked him that badly. The next night, earlier in the day, my mother-in-law, a police officer for a town 40 minutes away, installed 2 motion-activated trail cams along the wood's edge. They were brand new. Keep that detail in mind. Thinking maybe we'd see something, we waited for nightfall. Later that evening, I went outside to feed our outdoor cats. That's when I heard it again. Rustling. This time, not taking any chances, I ran inside and told everyone what I heard. They all piled up by the back door and urged me to go out there and look. Reluctantly, I agreed. I took my flashlight and walked to the edge of the woods. Knowing there was a trail cam covering this area, I figured if it got me, it would be on camera, and my sacrifice wouldn't be for nothing. As I got to the wood edge, I could hear it still rustling. I'm shaking at this point because I could tell it was maybe less than 15 yards in front of me. Everyone at the door was watching me and could hear this. Then it got quiet. For a moment, it was gone, or so I thought. Just as I'm scanning with my flashlight, I'm desperately trying to see a normal woodland creature so I can laugh this whole thing away. Boom, something fell out of a tree and hit the ground so hard it shook the soil beneath my feet. It was so close to that, I was sure it was going to lunge out the brush and snag me. I dropped my flashlight and ran 100 yards back to the house in what felt like 2 seconds. I screamed, "Get the duck in the house," as everyone was already scampering into the house. They heard and felt the thud too. Our neighbor Dave called my mother-in-law to ask what that loud crash was. For him to have heard it from well over 700 yards away is insane to me. Once the adrenaline died down, we realized that this happened right next to the trail cam. Problem solved, we got evidence of this thing. The next morning, we checked the SD cards on the trail cameras. They have videos up until 11:47 p.m., the rest is corrupted. They were both brand new trail cameras and SD cards. We reset everything and set them back up, and to this day, we've still never encountered the creature again nor caught anything on camera. I spent the majority of my life in Pennsylvania, so a majority of my hikes have been in the Pennsylvania wilderness. I can honestly say I have never seen anything weird, but I got you with creepy. In northeast Pennsylvania, around the Appalachian Trail, homeless people congregate and form communities. That is not creepy, it gets ducking cold up here. I'm sure it takes a community working together to get through the winter outside. Anyway, while hiking, it's not unusual to stumble across a community. The creepy part, it's known on the trails that they protect their camps with extreme violence. If you find one, do not disturb anything. Well, anyway, these communities can be pretty big. 20 to 30 makeshift tents or shelters are set up in the middle of the woods. Well, when you accidentally wander across one of the camps, they are always empty. But the fires are still going, and food is still cooking. So you know there are a bunch of people straight up watching you who are hiding. I always tried to make sure that I was not intently looking at any tents or belongings, pretty much just trying to keep my eyesight straight, and made my way as fast as possible through those camps. Never once have I ever seen even one of them. So it doesn't really make you feel all that safe, lol. Anytime I wandered into a camp, I made a mental note to never hike that area again unless in a group. I live deep in the mountains, and my hollow is surrounded by woods. There is a little spot you can walk to in the woods, which is just a giant circle with trees open all around it. Me and my friend went to have a picnic there that day and started hearing this really loud flute coming from the direction where no house is there. Sounded like a woodwind of some sort, very spiritual sounding. Mind you, all my neighbors were old, and I can guarantee that none of them spent their time walking deep in the woods to play the flute. We heard this for hours. We left about 8 that night, and when we walked back, you could hear it somewhat across the valley. I didn't hear it again for a good 2 years after, but one night I woke up at 3 a.m. and my bed was right next to the window, and I had it cracked to let some fresh air in while I slept. I woke up to the sound coming right outside my window, and I was too worried to look out to see what it was. It went on for about an hour before it stopped playing, and I never heard it again. When I was a kid, I lived in the rural parts of Oregon. I lived with my dad, brother, and our 3 dogs. There was a kind of forest that stretched for a few miles, and we shared it with our neighbors, the ones who had kids, not the other one. She never left her house. Our neighbors were about a mile away from us. My brother would bike down to his friend's house who lived in the city. We never bothered the kids that lived down the street. Their mom was a freak. Well, I mean, she was just paranoid, I guess. It would take my brother about 30 minutes to get there and 40 minutes for me because I would enjoy the forest and take a route I built in the trees. My brother would yell for me every once in a while to make sure I was okay. Our dad never let us do anything by ourselves. My brother would play with one of the kids that he made friends with while I would be drawing something under a tree or go out to one of the gas stations near where we hung out. Our dad would pick us up at 5, right before the sun went down, to drive us home. I would sometimes skip school just to play in the forest or look for mushrooms and bones for my ever-growing collection. But when I was 15, I found something very interesting, a camera. I thought this was very cool, so I brought it home with me. Then the next day, a lock of hair was on my favorite tree to climb. The hair was long, like a woman's hair. A week later, after I found the hair, I found a pile of bones. This was odd. I had never seen such perfectly placed bones in the forest before. They were laid out like a ladder on the ground, and I followed them. It seemed like they went on forever. I then heard one of our dogs behind me. Dad would send them out to find me if I went a little too deep into the forest. I decided that I would leave this bone thing to nature to deal with. Dad had made pasta with Alfredo, with red sauce on the side, for my brother. I remember that night so well that it still sends chills down my spine when I try to recall the memory. It may seem cliché, but this was terrifying to my 15-year-old self-mind. When I went into my room, I came straight from a shower, which sent shivers into my bones and made my chest tighten. This was my first sign to not go into my room, but I ignored it. When I grazed my palm onto my doorknob, another shiver chilled my bones, and at this point, my chest was so tight that I was taking deep, shallow breaths. The air was thick, almost heavy on my goosebumps-covered skin. I heard my brother's footsteps coming up the wooden steps. Against all of my instincts, I went into my room. My lights were off. I don't remember turning them off, though. My large window was wide open, and a skull lay on my desk, where I kept my other bones. A skull that I had not found, a skull that still had flesh attached to it, simulated that I could not identify where it came from. The room smelled like well-rotting meat. I was frightened, and I still don't know why I decided not to tell my dad or even my brother about this. I had a gut feeling that I shouldn't get rid of the skull. My gut was telling me that if I threw out that skull, whatever climbed up to my second-floor room, opened my window, and left me this gift, would be back to hurt me, or worse. At 1 a.m., I got out of bed, grabbed the skull with a Ziploc baggie that was lying on my floor, and took it outside. I was terrified of what brought me this skull, why, and if it was watching me now. I got to the shed where my brother did his woodworking for his woodworking class in school. I placed the skull on the table and grabbed one of his tools. I'm unfamiliar with the tool names, but it was the sharp, flat one used for carving. I used it to start chipping away at the flesh. I was horrified by what was under the mutilated fleshy skull. I recognized it from my anatomy classes. It was one of a human. I gasped, stumbling back and dropping the tool. It made an ear-bleeding sound as it shattered the silent night. I whipped around to make sure no one heard me, and there was a creature as tall as the shed. It was standing on its hind legs, its long torso twisted, and it moved unnaturally. Its front legs sagged down to its sides. They were short, almost like a ferret's body. But its head was long and narrow, its sharp facial bones pushing against its thinly furred flesh. It looked like a bad attempt at taxidermy. It then let out this unearthly shriek. I could hear my dogs barking from inside the house. I heard the front door slam open, and loud footsteps came quickly after. The creature looked at me. I blinked, and it was gone. My dad came running to the shed. He had a shotgun in hand. And I found myself dumbstruck, still trying to contemplate what I just witnessed. He ripped me out of the shed and dragged me all the way back inside the house. I quickly learned the truth about this creature that had been apparently watching me for years. My dad would hear it climbing up the house at night and try to shoot it down. But obviously, that wasn't working. So when he realized I wasn't in bed, he saw it coming out of the forest towards the shed. And that happened to be where I was. I could tell that he was obviously frightened by it, almost more than I was. I never went out to those woods again, and be careful if you ever see a trail of bones in the rural parts of Oregon. It was a warm August day in the summer of 2019. I had invited over some friends for an early birthday party since my birthday occurred in September and would be too hard to plan with school. Anyway, for some background, I live in Wisconsin on a 42-acre lot. I thought this would be prime for a bunch of high school kids so we could explore and play night games, as I haven't fully explored the land myself. I said this to all my friends. At 8, I helped my dad start a fire in our pit, where we sat around and told stories for a good hour and a half. Then we all wanted to go out and explore the trails on our land at night. My dad had me take a gun, as there were tons of coyotes, bears, and even wolves spotted on our land. The .308 hunting rifle I used was good enough. We start out and walk through the parts I'm familiar with. But my friends point out that they thought they heard footsteps not too far away from the trails. I brushed it off and told them that it was probably some small animal. After an hour of exploring, my friend Will points out a big deer trail, so we head out to see where it leads. About a minute into the new trail, I start to hear footsteps, but maybe no more than 20 yards away. I silence everyone and tell them to turn off their phone lights. I then hear what sounds like a few people talking to themselves in front of us on the trail. I then pull out my huge lights, the ones that can reach a mile, and turn them on. To my horror, I see a full-grown man in dark clothes standing about 60 feet away. My friends are freaking out at this point. So I take charge and yell at him that he is on private land and needs to get off. I then spot him reaching in his pocket as he pulls out a large hunting knife. I then remember a few of the girls starting to cry. The worst part was when he slowly started walking towards us, saying that I'd pay. His walk turned into a run, so I rushedly put my clip in the gun, chambered it, and banged. A shot rang out as I landed a shot on his left arm. He then started to run at me again, to which I chambered another round and fired again. This time, I hit the lower left part of his abdomen. I then yelled at my friends to run back, besides Will, as he was a big and strong friend. I gave him the light so I could call my dad and explain the situation. He heard the shots and was concerned. He then called the cops and waited for them to get there to lead them to me. But by the time they arrived, the man had died. My friends made it out okay, besides one girl fainting. I had trouble sleeping that night. Not the fact that I had killed a man in self-defense, but the fact that the cops had said that he was wanted in a case of murdering 2 other people up north. I just ended up staying up and talking to Will about it. And I don't know if it's related or not, but I noticed the motion lights turn on at around 2:30 a.m. that same night. One summer, 2 friends and I went camping for one night in a small forest. We were 14 and 15-year-old girls. There was a bonfire place about 100 meters from my house where we put up the tent. The ground is packed tight and has this hollow sound when you walk on it. The tent was big for 3 and kind of round. So it would be hard for someone to reach the top without collapsing on the tent wall. And it was an old tent, and the fabric was quite rotten. It did not rain that night. We did not bring any food or food equipment, except candy that we had inside the tent. What happened? We sat up gossiping and eating candy until midnight. When we tried to sleep, we heard hooves walking beside the tent. We lay still, listening, pretty sure there were curious roe deer. But it was also this rattling sound of metal that seemed weird. Not like tin cans, but just like night armor sounds from movies. Suddenly it started to blow up with a strong wind, and we started talking to ease the atmosphere. The hooves and metal sound reminded me of a night on a horse. Then my one friend said, "That sounds like 2 nights." We brushed it off as road deer, but we never heard them leave. We kept talking when suddenly the wind ripped open a huge gash in the middle of the tent roof, right above me, and a strong light, I can only describe it as lightning, came through the opening. We screamed, the wind stopped, and the light disappeared as quickly as it came. We didn't hear anything around us, it was dead silence. No sound of footsteps or hooves, no sound of a helicopter or anything. We just looked at each other, panicked out of the tent, and ran to my place for the rest of the night. I went back the next morning, took down the tent, and looked around. We found nothing that could help us figure out what happened. We did not drink or take drugs that night. My parents slept, so it couldn't be them messing with us. I've been much around in this little forest in my teens. Never experienced weird things before or after. In the aftermath, we nervously landed on some kind of rare lightning and rode deer with 1 foot in a metal can. But we didn't believe that either. I live in a rural town, far away from the bustling urban cities that many people live in. It's like those stereotypical small neighborhoods where everyone knows each other. I like living here, in the fresh, unpolluted air, with kind and friendly neighbors all around me. However, our town has a dark secret that no one speaks about. It's in the woods, right next to the town. Everyone in the town had gone to the woods at least once. We usually had some people go hunting there during the hunting season, and we also had plenty of people go for walks there. However, growing up, we have always heard terrible rumors about the forest. Amongst all the stories about mythical creatures and weird caves, one story in particular has stuck with me. Around 30 years ago, back when most of our parents were also teenagers, one group of 4 teenagers decided to go camping during the summer holidays. Their parents supported it, and so they set off after a couple days of preparation. On the first day, they quickly set up their tents, then went ahead and started to do a bit of exploration before settling down and setting up a campfire for the night. Towards the late evening, one of the teens, David, the only survivor, felt like something was wrong. He had that deep gut feeling, the one that grips your heart with an icy grip. He didn't know how to vocalize this to his friends, but he did tell them he felt something was wrong. Imagine sitting with your friends in an open forest with tall, dark trees, with a rather small campfire being the only source of light. You could say David was just scared, but he swore he could see a blur of movement in the thick darkness of the trees every now and then. He felt completely exposed out in the middle of nowhere, with the wind whistling against the trees. And then it happened, his friend Richard also noticed the movement in the trees. It was subtle before, but now it constantly appears all around them. It was the blur of a dark humanoid figure that kept disappearing and then reappearing in some other spot again. It happened to always be outside the perimeter of the campfire, so none of its details could ever be made out. By now, the teenagers were spooked, and everyone had realized that there was definitely something out there. It was also hard to convince each other that the movement was nothing more than a wild animal when the figure was, quite obviously, humanoid in shape. The group had 2 choices. To run back home quickly through the dark forest and be careful not to lose their way or trip and hurt themselves out in the middle of nowhere. Or to stay put at the campsite and wait until the morning to return home. That same figure began to move more frantically through the shadowy silhouettes of the trees, seeming like it was circling them like a predator hunting its prey. David decided to make a run home through the woods as the others yelled out after him. He would later say it was a gut instinct that told him to run as far away as he could from that thing. To continue running until his legs burned and his lungs felt like they were being pulled apart. As soon as David ran halfway to the line of trees, the creature suddenly stopped moving, causing David to freeze. A menacing silence descended upon the forest. The group, with the exception of David, was still huddled around the campfire, shivering not from the cold but from fear. The leaves began to rustle from beyond the tree line, and slowly but surely, the figure that had been circling and watching them for some time now appeared out of the tree line. As its features began to be illuminated by the light from the campfire, the group's screams filled the silence. As David would later describe it, the creature had a humanoid body and was wearing long track pants and a hoodie. However, there was something very wrong with it. Its face was upside down. The large, circular bloodshot eyes were in place of the mouth, while the nose was twisted and pointing upwards. The mouth of the creature was contorted into an upside-down grin, which almost looked like a cartoonish frown. The teeth were razor-sharp and yellow, with stains of red. Its skin was pale and thin, with blue veins visible all over the face. Its fingernails ended in long, sharp points like daggers. As the group stared at the creature in frozen fear, It lunged in a fraction of a second towards the three teenagers still next to the campfire. It used its nails to rip everyone apart in a few agonizing moments, like a paper shredder to a piece of paper. It then hungrily fed on the flesh of the dying teenagers. David broke out of his trance as soon as the creature locked its misplaced eyes directly with him. He turned around and began to run into the woods. The creature moved at an incredibly fast pace as it caught up to him in a matter of seconds. It grabbed David's arm and dug its nails deep into his shoulder until David's shrill screams could be heard from the town. It all happened in slow motion. David continued to pull away from the creature in a desperate attempt to run and get away from it, but the creature had a very solid grip on his entire arm. The creature had made one mistake, though, which let David survive. It had dug its nails so far into David's arm that, after a few long moments of David desperately pulling away, his entire arm ripped away from his body. David would later continue running until he collapsed from blood loss. An early morning runner would find him by the side of the running trail, and he would make a miraculous recovery in a city hospital. The campsite would be found later by the rescue crew, covered in blood and gore, with the barely recognizable bodies of the three boys arranged in a triangle around the long, dead campfire. David is still alive today, and he's told this story to every kid in town. You can see him stare out into the woods with his only hand leaning on the wooden fence of his balcony, watching the tree line with blank, empty eyes. People in our town would only go to the woods during the morning and be sure to come back before sunset. It's not that anyone fully believed David's story. Some thought he had developed false memories from the traumatic event, while others say he could have dreamed it up in his medically induced coma. But no one can deny the fact that night, something did happen in the woods. People may have tried to comfort themselves by not believing his story, but no one dared camp in the woods again. I live in New Hampshire, in the southern suburban area. When I was younger, and currently, I lived in a couple of places because of divorce. I'll start off with Mom's house. There were these woods that were behind my mom's house that we owned. We owned a pine-dominated acre, but the whole woods were about 20 acres. You could always see civilization from it, either the suburban house rows or a street on the other side that had no houses on the sides. These woods always felt warm to me, and I loved being in them. It was basically a third parent to me. However, on the other side of the street was another forest, full of 10-20-year-old oaks and birches. One day, when I was maybe 9 or 10, I was playing in the nice woods, and I had explored the whole 20 acres of them, so I decided to check out the other woods on the other side of the street. The road was flanked on both sides by forests, and there was a nursing home down the street. I crossed the street, and the moment I entered this forest, my mind was telling me to get out. I had a sensation of being watched. However, I have always been curious, so I pushed deeper until I came to a circular, thinner part of the forest, not a clearing, where there was a pile of trash ahead of me. Not drug paraphernalia, but old food and trashed clothing. Now, my inner voice was screaming, get out, get the hell out of here, so I ran back through the woods as fast as I could until I reached the road. I went back into the nice woods, and I felt fine. About 4 or 5 years later, I was kind of bored with the woods behind my house and wanted to check out the other forest again. I go back, now with a knife in a holster, to explore. I had my hand on my knife the whole time. I had the being watched and get out feelings again. I never found the thin part, but I found shoes. Dozens of old, rotting shoes. There was also a camping stove, an old propane can, food trash, and a camping pot. I picked it up and took it home since I needed a cooking pot for camping. I still have it. The part that actually scared me, though, were the shoes. All kinds of them. Nice shoes, little shoes, women's running shoes, baby shoes, all at varying ages and states of decay. I was freaked the hell out, but I kept pushing. I got to this 35-degree embankment, which I climbed, and found a residential area above it. There was a thick fence with no gate, and the other houses had no gate either. The trash and shoes were too deep in the forest to be thrown in by uncaring homeowners. I finally decided to leave. I was super scared by the time I got out of the forest, and I was and still am a very emotionally stoic person. However, the worst experience I have had yet was at my dad's house. Well, this was more of his neighborhood. It was a very tightly packed neighborhood, and it was surrounded by thin forests. Small forests of huge pines separated houses. It was in a city, but every now and then I would see a moose or deer. Moose are very, very, very rare down here. So, one day, I was walking my dog at dusk. It was almost total darkness, and the street lamps were on. I got close to a turn in my walking path with this pine and oak forest, and I thought I spotted something in the forest and froze from terror. My gut wrenched at the most horrible, despicable feeling ever. I felt like I was just told the worst news of my life. It looked like a deer standing up, not a Wendigo. It had a fat white belly and brown fur on its back. It was staring right at me. I originally saw its belly, but when I looked up at its face, I couldn't make out its face. I have good eyesight and should have been able to see it, but it was like my central vision had suddenly been switched to peripheral. It just blended in with the forest. I could see the body, but not the head. Then it fell to the ground, got on all fours, turned, and ran in the direction of a fence. On the other side of the fence, there is a dump. The forest it was in is only about 50 feet by 50 feet. It must have jumped about the 6-foot chain-link fence to get in and out. My dog, a hound who is normally smelling the pizza car 30 seconds before it arrives, noticed nothing. I could hear it run away, and the dog perked up and looked at it as it ran off. I immediately turned around. There is a bit of wood that is next to a river and past some farmland at the bottom of my estate. It is popular for dog walkers, and we recently got a dog at the time this happened. I wasn't there for this story, but I was for the next one I will tell. They are pretty short. The first one was that my parents had walked the dog. The walk takes you to the coast, but they stopped by a pretty sandy area, which I assume meets some water when the tide comes in enough. They decided to stray from the path to see if there was anything interesting in the woods. They found what my mom described as a shrine for a woman. Apparently, there were some fresh flowers by it, meaning it was apparently visited often by someone. My mom theorized that she had committed suicide or perhaps died in an accident when she said she heard a horrible sound. I remember she struggled to describe it to me and eventually settled on saying it sounded like from a horror movie where a demon comes up to the screen and bursts into flames, so I assume it was a kind of screeching or screaming. My mom said she felt that she, the woman the shrine was dedicated to, really did not want my parents to be there, so they quickly left. In the next story, I was there, but I don't think it was very supernatural, but it was creepy. Basically, I was walking the dog with my mom this time instead of my dad. My mom was really unnerved and worried for our dog, as we could hear quad bikes nearby and didn't want him to get harmed. At some point, we heard the quad bike right behind us, and I remember our dog was off the lead and my mom was having to chase him, to the point where I just pretty much commanded her to pick up the dog to prevent him from getting crushed. The man on the bike seemed okay as he passed, though I didn't get bad vibes. However, on the way back, we heard what I would describe as jovial voices in the forest, maybe drunken. I remember my mom being really unnerved, as she told me to walk faster and keep up with her, and our dog was kept on the lead. We kept looking over our shoulders in case there was someone there with ill intent, but we never saw anyone. It was so creepy because that was the first time I had seen my mom so anxious. These incidents have led me to nickname the forest the Cursed Forest. I was an avid backpacker until I moved to California last year for graduate school. I've got a couple spooky ones for you. I was up in the Baker Wilderness, right up on the Canadian border. I was on a 4-day backpack, covering 15 miles on the first day and 11 on the second, with plans to hike out the same way we came in. On the second day, we are pretty deep in the backcountry. The ranger's office warned us the trail wasn't regularly maintained and to expect slow going. There were lots of washouts and a little bushwhacking, but we were close to the primitive site at that point. Suddenly, I noticed absolute silence. Now I've spent a lot of time in the woods, and you start to get a sense for when shit's about to get dangerous, whether that be because of an animal or something else. This time, it was something else. We hike through some dense brush and get to a clear section of trail, and out of the woods, from a steep bank to the left, tumbles a dude giving off some real bad vibes. He was filthy. Wearing a shirt missing all its buttons with nothing underneath. He was extremely malnourished, and his pants hung loosely on his hips, fastened with a bit of rope strung through the belt loops. Worse yet, he had a big-ass revolver in his hand. He walked towards us, dragging an injured foot behind him, gesticulating with his gun, and talking to himself. I decided to just try and be chill, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared. The weird thing was that he didn't even notice us until he was basically on top of us. About a meter away, he stopped and looked at me. He asked, "Well, have you seen the bitch?" To which I responded that we hadn't seen anyone today. Without another word, he limped down the trail past us, and we never saw him again. We checked in at the ranger station, and they said there was no other way to the site and that they weren't aware of any other hikers. They said they'd look into it, but I'm not sure what happened after that. Weird SHT, though. My friend, we'll call him Marv, likes to go solitary camping on occasion to be one with nature and the things that go along with that. He is also an avid gun collector and enthusiast. I don't remember exactly when he said this took place, but it was a few years ago, and he decided to go camping on a whim. He packed his gear, a few guns, a hunting rifle, and a .45 sidearm specifically, and headed out into the country onto a vast swatch of property owned by a friend of his. He had full permission for the work. This happened close to the Coyote National Forest in south-central Louisiana. I won't be any more specific than that. It's safe to say it's miles and miles of forest and wilderness. He liked to hike in pretty deep and camp at a specific spot he found a few trips prior. These details are kind of sparse, as there's not really meat or potatoes in this encounter. So he made his way in and set up camp in his usual small clearing for the night. Skipping ahead a few hours, it was now late afternoon when he heard leaves crunching and twigs being stepped on. He assumed it was an animal at first and got up from cooking something on the fire to try to get a look. He gazed in the direction of the noise and saw a man approaching through the trees, a good many yards away. He has described his etiquette for dealing with other people in very remote places as always being cautious, as more often than not, people he comes across are armed like him. He tries to stay as friendly as possible but still keeps his guard up, looking for any ulterior motives, as you never can tell what some folks are up to out in the middle of nowhere. He'll make chit-chat with them, find out generally what they're up to if he can, and occasionally share a meal, etc. He's never really met anyone nefarious as of yet, other than this situation and maybe one other, but that's a whole other ordeal. So one thing that sets off small alarm bells for him is that he knows he's the only one with permission to be on this property, and secondly, this guy is not dressed for the location at all. He said the guy was wearing a white t-shirt, short blue jogging shorts, and white socks and sneakers. Mind you, Marv is miles out in the middle of the woods, away from any paths, roadways, houses, or anything really. Nobody is going to casually stroll into his current location dressed like that unless they are lost, confused, etc. It was early fall but not quite cool, very normal for Louisiana, so there's a ton of mosquitoes, ticks, and other insects aplenty. You're not going to have most of your skin exposed if you can keep it deep in the woods. I know that all too well from personal experience, so Marv assumes something might be up and calls out, "Hey there, do you need help or something?" Pretty loud. Definitely loud enough to be heard. The guy keeps walking forward, staring directly at him. Marv is starting to get unnerved, and as I said, I know this guy well, and he's cool as a cucumber in a tense situation. Getting more uneasy, as the guy is closing the distance, he gets to his feet and loudly declares, "Hey man, can I help you with something or what?" The guys are 15 to 20 feet away from Marv, now standing at the edge of the clearing and the forest. The guy looking Marv dead in the eye speaks and clearly says, "Help me." Marv said he was already starting to actually get worried at this point because he said the way the guy said this was as if something that didn't know exactly how to talk was saying, "Help me," or at least that's what he first thought. It did not sound right. The guy, still unmoving, says, "Help me." Again, slightly more emphatic, but really just slightly louder. Marv said this is when he picked up on what was truly wrong about this. He said the timbre of the voice was more female and actually sounded like a recording being played back, and that the guy's lip and mouth movements weren't matching up with the phrase. It's like he was just opening his mouth, emitting the phrase, and closing it again. Marv asked, "What do you need help with?" Not daring to back up or move whatsoever. The guy, still standing motionless and still looking directly at him, said "Help me" again and repeated the phrase 3 more times, slowly but not louder in volume. Marv, now totally unsure of what the hell is going on, interrupts the guy by barking, "All right, you need to duck and go now unless you actually need my help." "Do you need my help or not?" he continued, loud and firm in tone. The guy didn't miss a beat and started up with the "help me's" again and made as if to take another step in Marv's direction. Marv told me that he then did the only thing that made sense in the moment and drew his .45 semi-auto pistol and pointed it at the guy, telling him again, "You need to duck and go. I don't care what you want." The guy starts to get more animated and agitated, actually starting to say the phrase louder now over and over but not stepping closer or backing away. Marv did what he thought was right given his current predicament, assuming he was dealing with an unstable or potentially dangerous individual, and discharged a round into the ground in front of the guy. Now this is where it gets fully batshit crazy, I'm not kidding, as the guy stops uttering the phrase, goes silent, and is still staring at Marv, full of backflips or somersaults, like gymnasts do, backwards into the woods and immediately out of sight. Yes, you read that right, now I know what you're thinking because I had and still have the same reaction. That sounds like bullshit for sure, but Marv gave no indication of falsehood and told me this multiple times, each time in a dead serious demeanor. Yet Marv said the guy backflipped away effortlessly, as if pulled back by an unseen tension coil. He described it as completely humanly unnatural and totally out of place. The guy had just appeared and repeated the same phrase over and over, eventually becoming almost frantic before Marv shot at the ground before him, causing him to flee. Marv said he stood there focused on the forest where the guy just flipped and saw and heard no further movement. It was like the guy had never even been there. He stayed like this as the sun began to set and the normal night noises crept in. As I mentioned before, Marv is a pretty unshakable fellow and actually stayed in the area for the night and the next night before returning with no further incident. When he told me and some other friends about this, of course, we asked many questions. We asked him to elaborate on the guy's speech sounds. He said the more he thought about it after the incident, the more sure he was that it was definitely a female's voice coming from the guy. It was like he or she had heard someone say this and mimicked it like a parrot or other talking bird would. It's almost like a lure. He doesn't know what it wants. It, yes, it might qualify as an it, didn't give any indication to follow or utter anything else. He or she reacted immediately to the gunshot, and you know what followed there. He has been back to the property since, with no other strange occurrences. The only other minute detail that I can think of is that he did remember hearing during the early morning of the first night what sounded like a gunshot in the distance, and it did sound eerily similar to his. 45. He thought he may have heard it again on the hike back out. There are people that hunt in the area, of course, and it could have just been that. He couldn't be sure. Since this incident, and one other he had in a completely different location, he did some online research of the whole Coyote area and found many legends, stories, and supposed encounters dealing with skinwalkers and other unnerving bits of Native American folklore in the area. Not to mention mimics and other similar supposed creatures. A lot of his encounter lines up with these tales, but there's nothing tangible to prove it, of course. But even as a skeptic, it does make me wonder about strange things in the remote and untouched areas of our world that can't be explained. So near my home, there is a huge forest. I live in the countryside. I know the beginning of the forest by heart because I have lived here since I was born. One day, like the others, I met a person who seemed to paint. I must say that I only go to the forest at night because it is much more interesting. Everything was fine. I continued my road in the forest, and I noticed that the person I had seen was following me. Being alone, I decided to take advantage of the fact that I knew this part of the forest with the aim of leaving on as quickly as possible from this person following me. Continuing my road off the small paths, I get lost quickly. I would like to specify that it must be midnight at this time, that I am alone, and that I am a minor. After several minutes of racing, I went to a point, which I recognized easily. I was in the abandoned building, which is the furthest place in the forest I have ever visited. So I decided to go back and try to call the police and my parents, but I had no cellular network, which proves how deep I was in the forest. I heard noises several times outside the building, and it froze my blood. I was terrified. I made the decision not to venture into unfamiliar territory and hid in a corner while waiting for the person to leave. From there, I don't really remember what happened, but the next day around dinner time, I think, I woke up and set off on my way home. So much for the story. Still, to this day, I have not returned to the forest in question. My parents thought I was running away, so they called the police. They never believed my story, but I know it was real. I still don't know what this person wanted, and it's freaking me out. This experience happened to me when I was 14 years old. I hadn't spoken to anyone about the event since it happened, not even my significant other. I live in the high desert mountains of Southern California, situated just below the Sierra Nevadas, about 30 minutes west of Mojave. My town is not a booming metropolis. At the time, our largest market was a Kmart, one of the last still in business, I might add, and we only had 4 stoplights in town. This takes place in a subsection of the town, about 13 miles from the shops, banks, and restaurants, in a small community largely inhabited by retirees. It's smack dab in the middle of summer, and the temperatures were well in the high 90s to low 100s. My nightly routine would consist of walking my Australian Shepherd. However, I would wait until it was almost dark to avoid the heat. I grabbed my phone, a small pocket knife, some headphones, and my pup, and set out for my nightly walk. My community is also home to a significant number of equestrian riders as well as cattle ranchers. The trails I walked were designated horseback riding trails set between pastures. That night, I decided to take the horse trail that stretches for approximately 2 miles between back-to-back paddocks. It's basically a long, narrow trail that's between very large backyards. My ending destination was the Equestrian Center, a communal equestrian park where all types of horse riders could enjoy various activities on their horses. As I made my way through the sandy terrain of the trail, it was nearly dark now. The sky was becoming a deeper shade of blue every time I looked up, and my dog was becoming harder to see. I estimated my arrival at the Equestrian Center to be around 15 minutes from my current position, so I sent a text to my mother. "I'll be at the Equestrian Center in about 15 minutes, could you meet me there?" I'm too tired to walk back. My mother had replied, sure, I'll leave in 10 minutes. Now, at this point, I was just outside the east entrance of the equestrian center, where the enchanted forest trail connects to the straight trail I was on, sort of like a three-way intersection. You can either go left into the enchanted forest trail or go straight into the equestrian center. Before I reached the intersection of the trails, I noticed a shift in my dog's behavior, as she became anxious and seemingly worried. She had her eyes fixated on the forest and stopped dead in her tracks. I played it off as another animal within the forest, like a bobcat or boar, as they weren't uncommon in my area. I gave her a slight tug on her collar, although she was still incessantly focused on the forest. With a little more convincing, I was able to get her moving forward, pushing on towards the equestrian center, where my mother would be waiting for our arrival. Now, it was nearly pitch black, with only the moon guiding me with its low light. There was just the slightest of visibility, forcing me to turn on my cell phone's dim flashlight. Entering the equestrian center now, I noticed something that startled me immensely. A very tall person, a man, about 10 to 15 feet into the enchanted forest trail with his back towards me standing completely still, his head facing the sky and his hands open, palms pointing in front of him while his arms are at his side. He was tall, approximately 6 feet, had a slim build, short dark hair, was wearing what looked to be light blue scrubs, or at least a very thin blue napkin-like material, and was barefoot. What startled me the most was his demeanor and what he was doing. His stance was enough to scare anyone in that setting, but, as I approached him slowly, it appeared to me he was shaking, vibrating, or slightly convulsing, but doing so while standing up. It didn't seem like he had any control over it, although he remained in perfect balance. Scared and not entirely sure what to do, I asked him, "Hello, excuse me?" I paused momentarily and raised my voice slightly with the next question, "Is everything all right?" When I said that, he stopped shaking altogether but still didn't turn around or move another muscle. He just remains in that same creepy position and doesn't even move. For a brief moment, I thought I might have been imagining this. I glanced down at my dog, and she was also concerned with the state and condition of this man and began growling quietly. Then I knew it wasn't all in my head. When I looked back up, he had moved closer to me, about 7 feet closer, now almost on my trail path. I had only looked at my dog for a split second, and he did it without making a sound. He still wasn't facing me either, and his hands were still open and his head was still facing the sky. I wasn't about to wait and see what this guy was doing or what his intentions were, so I slowly eased my way past him towards the equestrian center as quietly as I could before I felt that I was at a safe enough distance to start sprinting as fast as I could away from this guy. When I reached the first arena of the equestrian center, I looked back in the direction of the forest completely out of breath, and there he was. The ducker was standing on the edge of a trail outside of the forest, standing there, facing me. I was too far away to see his face, and frankly, I didn't want to. I couldn't make out the features. All I could see was his silhouette illuminated by the moonlight peeking through the forest trail. I continued to run with no intention of stopping until I found someone. I had never been so happy to see my nagging neighbor, Penny, and her moody mare, Jolene, riding in the Milano area. She noticed my distress, but due to her already harsh opinions of me, I had told her I had been on an endurance run and was just very out of breath and tired. I wanted to avoid any small-town gossip as much as I could. My mother arrived with impeccable timing. During the ride home, I broke down in a state of paranoia, distress, and panic at what I had just witnessed. My mother didn't know exactly what to make of it, so she recommended I file a police report with the local PD. About an hour after getting home, an officer shows up to take my statement. Following up the next day, the same officer claims to have gone and checked out the area but didn't find anyone or anything out of the blue apart from partials of bare footprints, but there's nothing incriminating or suspicious about someone going for a walk without shoes. He played it off as a joke and accused me of being under the influence, but I can assure you, I was completely sober. Nothing ever came out of this. I attended weekly therapy sessions for almost 2 years following this event and never went on walks by myself ever again. I had night terrors about the man and still do. I still don't know what to make of it. I don't know if I ever will. I go hunting in southern Illinois on property that my family owns. The place is my second home, and I've spent countless hours exploring every inch of it. I caught all the fish in the area, hunted every legal game, and spotted the rest. So when I say that I've never had an experience like this, just remember that this was my domain that I felt comfortable in any weather, at any time, with any equipment, or lack thereof. 2 deer seasons ago, I had pulled into the farm at probably about 4:40 in the morning. November, so at least 2 hours of sunlight. I pull my stuff out of the truck and walk into the woods. I have my shotgun and a revolver/knife on my belt, an elbow light clipped to the front of me, a thermos of coffee, a backpack with a book, and a couple other things for cleaning my deer should I get lucky. So, I walk off the drive and into the woods. The tree stand I'm going to is less than a mile away, but through some dense second-growth forest and down a rather steep hill, across some bottoms, then a lung-burning steep climb up to another ridge. I always dread the hike, but it's a good spot, so I often do it. I make it down to the bottoms, slush through the icy muck, and get to climbing. With my flashlight clipped to my chest, I keep needing to physically turn my body to throw the beam around and see trees that I recognize to determine my path. This, of course, always gives the forest a horror movie vibe, even on the best of days. The leaves and underbrush are encased in frost, so every one of my steps comes with a solid crunch, no matter how quiet I'm trying to be. This time, though, I noticed there was more noise than usual. Something else was crunching close by too. I walked about a quarter of the way up the hill, listening to my company the whole time, seeming to stay the same distance away as I moved. Naturally, I think to myself that I'm going to have a quick hunting day, so I plop my ass down next to a tree. I can't shoot until first light, but I'm hoping that if I stay really still, whatever I'm hearing will lounge around until then. So I click my light off, unsling the shotgun, and lay it over my knees to wait. Except, I don't hear SHT now. Whatever it was must have been spooked by my flashlight spinning all around as I sat. I still stayed a bit, sipping some coffee to make sure, but gave up after 15 minutes or so of dead silence from the forest floor. I probably didn't make even 4 steps before the second moving thing started again. At this point, I'm still not freaked out. I stay facing the way I am, flip the light off again, and sidestep behind a tree. Sure enough, I don't hear anything again. 2 minutes of sitting there frustrated before I start moving again, and my new friend does too. This is when I started to get freaked out because I worked my way up the hill, stopping to turn and look every so often. When I stopped, the sound would go on for just an infinitesimally longer amount of time than my own steps, like something that saw me stop and did its very best to stop before I heard it. This happened no less than 4 times, and by now I'm sweating bullets and freezing cold because I'm sweating bullets in the middle of winter. I abandoned my thermos near a tree so I could hold my flashlight and my revolver at the same time. The last 100 feet or so to my stand were done backwards so that I could be facing the noise and, in theory, keep it from moving. And I didn't hear shit again after that. I got up into my stand and smoked like 5 cigarettes in a row. It gave me a sense of security to be up in a tree behind camouflage. Still, I only hunted for like an hour of daylight and went back early, and I wasn't ducking, moving slowly heading back to the truck, even with the sun shining bright. I haven't told my family about it because they wouldn't believe me, but damn, was it freaky? The sound and when it decided to happen felt very human, which it likely was as poachers and trespassers occasionally wandered onto our property. Still, ever since then, when I go hunting, I'm much better about letting people know where I'm going and for how long. My buddy and I hiked into a state forest where the AT runs this past spring with the plan to spend a couple days out to camp and hunt turkeys. We'd been up there a few times that winter and knew of a few general areas near a shelter to set up our tent where it was flat and not very rocky. We were getting our tent set up and then planning a quick hike to some spots to check for turkey signs before it got dark. He was unloading some of his gear in the tent when I walked to the edge of the little clearing we set up to take a leak. I swear I saw and heard a person moving quickly away from the edge of the clearing, but through some super thick mountain laurel. I didn't think much of it since we were near the trail and there was a shelter less than a quarter mile away, so I figured it was a guy looking for a spot to get set up. After our short scouting hike, we got back, and it was starting to get dark but still bright enough to see with no headlamp. We decided to make a little fire to hang around while we ate dinner. I started walking around the edge of the clearing, looking for firewood, when I saw movement and heard running again. This time I let out a loud yo, just to make our presence known, and I heard the running fade off. I was a little spooked, but nothing happened after that. I still don't know what it was. Logically, a deer makes sense, but I swear I saw a person and they had a red t-shirt. We ended up setting up there again the next night, and I went into the thick stuff to find a good spot to dig a hole to do. You know what? I went right to where I saw whatever I did, and sure enough, it was super thick mountain laurel and no game trails or tracks through there. I never got a real strong something isn't right feeling or anything besides a little uneasiness in the moment. I don't really have much of an explanation for it. I was living down in West Texas in this national park, where the restaurant where I was working at the time rested at the top of a 15-minute hike up a mountain trail from the housing they had us in. I closed up the restaurant after everyone left each night, so I was always an hour or two later coming down the hill than everyone else. Usually pretty empty, really quiet, and uncommon to encounter anyone else, as the only thing at the top of the mountain is the closed restaurant, gift shop, store, and some of the trailheads. There isn't much reason for anyone else to be on the trail at that hour. And this one ducking night, I'm coming down, there was no moon, so it was pitch black, empty, and characteristically quiet. I round this last bend to get to my house, and right before I get off the trail to take a shortcut through the thicket of cactus and brush, there were maybe 15 to 20 trees. Even though it's a desert, the top of the mountain has a high Sierra microclimate. I hear my best friend or roommate call out my name, clear as day, in the other direction. He said my name, and when I turned, he said it again. In retrospect, it sounded funny. It was close, maybe 15 yards, but it sounded far off at the same time. Like if someone recorded his voice from far away but played it very nearby. It just sounded off, but not enough to flip a switch immediately. And maybe I'm painting the memory of it differently than it actually sounded. So, I'm facing my house, maybe 50 yards away, and the voice comes from directly to my left. On this foothill of the mountain, we'd hike around sometimes. It has much more tree coverage than the trail I was on, and considerably more than the thicket separating me from the clearing surrounding my house. If you walked 5 feet in the direction the voice came from, you'd completely disappear from the view of anyone on the trail or on the back porch of the house. Immediately. So, hearing my friend's voice calling me over, I was like, oh, cool, we're night hiking, and I turned to follow it, but right before I took my first step into the tree line, I heard his actual voice down on our porch saying, "Hey, who are you talking to?" Which stopped me. I turned back to face my house, confused as shit, just in time to see this ducking thing burst out of the ducking thicket I was just about to shortcut through to begin with before hearing the first voice and turning away. And, from the exact spot I had walked down every single night, this ducking thing bolts. It was technically humanoid, but the thing is tall as shit and way too skinny for a human. Like at least 8 feet tall, but slim. It looked inhumanly slender. He was hunched over and running like he just burst off a track mark, you know? But kept that same form the whole time, never getting all the way upright. Okay, so, as for the color, that has always ducked with me, because for one, I'm colorblind as shit, and it was like a greenish/yellow thing, and I get greens and yellows mixed up a lot, this hue of green and yellow, at least. And for two, it looked like it was giving off its own glow, which has always sounded so absolutely ludicrous that I never tell anyone that I do not absolutely trust to give me the benefit of the doubt before thinking that I'm completely bullshitting. Because, if I heard this story, I would honestly think someone at the very least might be a little bit bullshitting. Our back porch light was on, though, and the thing lined up with where it would have been shining, so if this thing was translucent, it definitely could have taken on that sheen by reflecting the porch light. The colors do kind of line up, I guess. If you'd reflected the light, it may have looked like this thing's color, but it certainly wasn't identical. Sincerely, though, I swear it had its own shine to it. Like looking at a glow stick that's dying. More than enough to see, but kind of faint. Regardless, it was a light that definitely wasn't there a second before when I'd gotten to the shortcut. It would have stuck out for the last 50 yards of the walk, at least. It should be noted that had I followed that thing's voice, 2 things would have happened. 1, I would have completely disappeared from the view of anyone, and 2, I would have turned my back on whatever that thing was and entered into a thicket of trees, weeds, and cacti far too dense for me to turn around, run, fight back, or do anything else. And that trail I would have gone toward leads directly to the edge of a cliff that drops down into a massive break in the mountain, the window in Big Bend National Park, that cleanly drops all of the 6.000 feet to the wide open desert below. That could be the purpose of that direction. To be honest, if I were going to try to do some nefarious shit, it would be the perfect place to both find someone and lead them quickly to a spot where no one else would come up on you. Legit, in the middle of the day, you could probably make someone disappear over there if you wanted. Anyway, no matter how this thing was running, it immediately felt like a ducking spooked it. Like how a deer runs off at a noise, but this was different in that it seemed a lot more determined. It seemed intelligent, aware of its own movement, and not just acting out of instinct. Kind of like spooking a person if they'd been watching you from the bushes or something, you know? Like, spooked but sentient, and definitely acting like I just foiled some nefarious plan. So, naturally, I also ducking bolt, exposing my back to this thing, but taking the opposite, slightly longer way to my back porch. My ducking buddy, God bless his soul, is still there when I make it, and he asks again, "Who are you with?" His face is just confused as shit, and he keeps looking past me, and I'm like, "You heard it, too, right?" And he says, "Yeah, where are they?" And I was like, What? There were multiple? Apparently, from his perspective, he had heard multiple voices alongside my own, all carrying on and joking around, talking back and forth pretty loudly. He said there were at least 3 other voices talking to mine, but that it sounded like a whole crowd coming down the trail. He said he could clearly hear us getting closer and closer for the past few minutes and just assumed I'd run into a hiking group and talk with them as we headed down, not the most uncommon thing in the daytime, but pretty uncommon for the hour of night. It took me a minute to show him that I wasn't messing with him and had not just split off from a group of hikers. I was completely alone and had not vocalized a word until he called up to ask, "Who are you with?" It took me a second to even express my side of what was going on. I was so out of whack I couldn't find the words to actually explain, so I just kept shouting, "I swear to God, I just heard your voice, and then this ducking thing. Dude. This thing." Or something similar. Eventually, it registers that there were no other lights on the trail. I wasn't using a flashlight that night, so maybe there was actually some moon out, and I had just heard his voice calling me off trail and into the dark, and we both began trying to figure out what the duck we just witnessed. Okay. This part might be a little crazy, but I'm not implying anything, I'm just saying. This is what I'd been doing on the walk down before this happened. So, obviously, walking home solo, I hadn't actually said a word. Whoever he heard was certainly not me, and I certainly didn't come with a crowd. But I had been praying like crazy on the hike down. There had just been this super dark, negative energy in the house lately, and I was just trying to kind of surround myself with light and positivity, asking God to give me strength before I walked back in, and out of nowhere, midway through the trail, I got this, like, absolutely overwhelming joy, like an absolute ecstasy. I was like screaming inside, happy as bones, and just felt like I could take on the whole MF world. Like no matter what came, I could take it. Maybe I am implying something, because call me crazy, but I've always felt like that had something to do with how the night turned out as opposed to how it maybe would have. I know that part really does make me sound insane, but so does the rest of it, so whatever. I certainly don't think it was a coincidence. I'm just not sure what to make of any of it. Every detail means every detail, that's just what was going on with you as the walk was happening. It would have been a noteworthy and memorable night had the thing not done any of this, it was that powerful of an energy. Anyway. That's pretty much it. The only other thing is our memory of it. Out of nowhere, I just sort of stopped thinking of it. Not like I forgot, but like it was hidden behind some thick fog in my head. The next morning, I told the story to a friend, and she uncharacteristically shut me down and just said something like, "Y'all are just crazy and getting scared of these mountains," and I just walked away. It really was not like her to just dismiss someone, especially a friend, without even hearing them out. She was a really empathetic lady. It was legit, like she just heard something that triggered a memory she refused to touch and shut down before it got too close. I could be reading into it. But that's happened a couple of times with this story. And anyway, we'd been living on that mountain off and on for a few years at that point and had never once heard or seen anything remotely similar to that thing. Until that night, we'd never even heard a story even vaguely resembling that. It just wasn't like we got spooked out of our own house or the trail we took twice a day, every day. And it wasn't like we were seeing and hearing things based on stories we'd projected into the darkness, you know? But the weirdest, ducking thing happened the moment she walked away. It was legit, like a ducking fog just slowly poured over the memory, and the last time I remember thinking of it was that moment, and then it just ducking disappeared for months. How in the world does something that massive and frightening happen in your life and you just stop thinking about it? And then one day it just popped the duck back up. I was honestly so surprised and unsure of how I hadn't thought of it in so long. It was almost more baffling than anything we actually witnessed. I asked my friend just before I sent this if he'd felt the same fog thing, and he said, absolutely. He doesn't really like talking about that night, honestly, and he's told me that, but I cannot help but bring it up as often as possible, hoping that by talking it through we'd find some sort of explanation for any of what happened. Even as I typed the message, though, I felt like I'd asked him a million times already and just forgotten his answer. Maybe I have, that isn't a super uncommon thing to do, I guess. Anyway. That's pretty much everything. I really don't know what to make of all of this. All I have are the details of that night and my memory doing something bizarre afterward. I have never known what to make of it.